the lens and the field. 2. A living codex of seeing, shaping, and the edge of meaning. A transmission on the mechanics of awareness, the collapse of separation, and the threshold where meaning yields to direct knowing. There is a way of seeing that does not rely on belief. A way of knowing that does not depend on definition. A way of being that precedes explanation. This work is not written to convince. It is not written to argue. It is not written to conclude. It is written to point to the space where seeing arises before meaning. Distinction emerges from undifferentiated potential. Experience unfolds prior to interpretation. To the mechanism through which reality becomes perceivable. Perception shapes the world as it is known. Meaning stabilizes what is seen into form. And to the threshold where language reaches its limit. Concepts dissolve into direct recognition. And what remains cannot be contained, only encountered. This is not a book to be read once. It is a structure to be entered. There are no claims here that must be believed. There are no doctrines that must be followed. Only patterns to be recognized. Only mechanisms to be seen. If you are looking for answers, you may not find them here. If you are willing to see, you may find that what you were looking for was never separate from the one who was looking. Enter accordingly. Opening transmission, the threshold beyond meaning. There comes a point where meaning can no longer lead. Not because meaning has failed in its function. Not because language is useless. Not because thought is the enemy. Not because structure has no place in the architecture of awareness. Meaning has served its role. It has differentiated. It has stabilized. It has organized. It has rendered the world navigable. It has turned raw contact into recognizable form. It has allowed the human system to orient, survive, communicate, build, remember, and refine. But there is a threshold in the unfolding of awareness where the very mechanism that once clarified begins to reveal its limitation. Meaning can take the system far, but not all the way. There is a point where representation can no longer precede contact without distorting the very thing being met. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is the discovery of its edge. The mind, in its refining, sharpens its distinctions. It becomes more coherent. It becomes more precise. It learns to detect contradiction, to organize symbol, to stabilize patterns, to hold complex structures without immediate collapse. It becomes more disciplined in its seeing. Yet as the structures refine, something else begins to happen. The refined mind eventually discovers that no matter how precise its representations become, representation remains downstream. Description remains after the fact. Meaning remains successive. Concept remains a rendering of contact, not contact itself. The more clearly the mind sees the mechanics of its own operations, the more it begins to recognize that there is something prior to all formulation, something that cannot be fully contained by the very structures that arise from it. This is the threshold. It is not reached by abandoning thought, but by exhausting its illusion of primacy. It is not reached by destroying language, but by seeing language as echo rather than source. It is not reached by rejecting meaning, but by recognizing that meaning is not the first movement. Meaning is derived. Meaning is successive. Meaning is the shaping, the stabilization, the interpretation, the relational assignment through which experience becomes legible to a system. Meaning is essential, but it is not original. Before meaning, there is contact. Before contact is named, there is appearance. Before appearance is interpreted, there is the sheer fact of seeing. And before even the articulation of seeing, there is that strange and unspeakable threshold where something is met before it has become symbol. This is why there comes a point where what is being encountered can no longer be fully described, only recognized. Recognition is deeper than formulation. It does not require complete explanation in order to be real. It does not ask permission from the symbolic mind. It does not wait for narrative to approve it. It arrives as a directness that precedes full conceptual capture. It is not irrational. It is not anti-intellectual. It is not a retreat into vagueness. It is a more foundational mode of contact. It is the moment where awareness is no longer waiting for meaning to tell it what something is before it allows it to be real. It is the moment where the system begins to perceive directly and lets meaning follow behind rather than dictate ahead of time. This is not the end of knowing. It is the beginning of direct contact. This distinction matters completely. The ordinary mind imagines that if meaning ceases to lead, then one is entering chaos, confusion, irrationality, or the collapse of truth itself. But this is not what happens. What happens is more radical and more simple. Knowing ceases to be exclusively representational. It ceases to rely only on symbol, only on abstraction, only on concept, only on linguistic containment. Another order of knowing begins to emerge. A knowing through immediacy. A knowing through recognition. A knowing through direct participation in what is present before the system has fully arranged it into explanation. This does not eliminate thought. It reorders it. It does not eliminate intelligence. It deepens it. It does not eliminate meaning. It returns meaning to its rightful place. Meaning is no longer the ruler. Meaning becomes the translator. And this reordering changes everything. The fragmented observer lives as though explanation is the gateway to reality. They believe they must first define in order to know, first categorize in order to see, first represent in order to contact. Their world is mediated through inherited meaning to such a degree that they rarely notice that explanation has come before experience. They do not simply encounter the world. They encounter their rendering of it. They do not simply see. They see through a stabilized interpretation system that tells them what is possible, what is impossible, what is real, what is symbolic, what is obvious, what is strange, what is acceptable, what is threatening, what is worthy of attention, and what must remain invisible. Meaning leads, and because meaning leads, contact is filtered before it is allowed to fully arrive. But at the threshold beyond meaning, this order begins to invert. Experience is no longer filtered through explanation first. It is met directly. This directness is not a fantasy. It is not the absence of structure. It is not a return to primitive confusion. It is the reappearance of something far more original than interpretive control. It is the recognition that the act of seeing is prior to what the system says about what is seen. It is the realization that awareness is capable of meeting reality before reality has been fully domesticated into language. This is why the threshold feels so strange to the mind. The mind is used to leading. It is used to going first. It is used to naming, sorting, framing, protecting, and assigning meaning before deeper contact can unfold. When that priority falls away, the system experiences a kind of nakedness. Not because something has gone wrong, but because what was always primary has begun to reveal itself again. Here, meaning follows behind as an echo. This is one of the deepest corrections in the architecture of experience. Meaning is not destroyed. It still comes. It still functions. It still articulates, translates, communicates, integrates, and stabilizes what has been seen. But it no longer claims to be the source of reality. It no longer mistakes itself for the thing. It no longer stands at the gate declaring what may or may not enter awareness. It receives what contact has already revealed and begins the downstream work of interpretation. In this posture, meaning becomes more honest, more permeable, less tyrannical. It is no longer forced to pretend to be the entire truth. It can simply become a faithful derivative of what has been directly met. This changes the entire relationship between awareness and reality. Because once experience is met directly, it becomes clear that so much of what passed as certainty was only compressed meaning. So much of what passed as truth was only stabilized interpretation. So much of what passed as reality was a rendering held together through symbol, agreement, repetition, and unconscious allegiance. This does not mean all meaning is false. It means all meaning is downstream. It means all meaning is partial relative to that which gave rise to it. It means that what the mind can say will always trail what awareness can directly encounter. And once this is seen, a new humility enters the system. Not the humility of self-erasure, but the humility of proportion. The humility that comes when representation stops pretending to be the source of what it represents. This threshold is also the beginning of a different kind of rigor. Because once meaning can no longer hide behind its own authority, the system must become more honest about what it actually knows. It must distinguish between direct recognition and conceptual overlay. It must learn to sense when it is in contact and when it is only manipulating symbols. It must become sensitive to the difference between living coherence and polished narrative. It must be able to feel when explanation is serving contact and when it is replacing it. This is a stricter path, not a looser one. It requires more discernment, not less. It requires the system to stop using language as a shield against what it does not yet know how to contain. This is why the threshold beyond meaning is not anti-meaning. It is pro-truth. It is pro-contact. It is pro-coherence. It is the restoration of the right order of operations within awareness itself. First, something is encountered. Then, if the system is clear enough, it is recognized. Then, and only then, does meaning begin its rightful work. This opening transmission stands at that exact threshold. It is not here to offer a closed doctrine. It is not here to finalize the unspeakable into a finished system. It is not here to pretend that language can contain the center from which language itself emerges. It is here to orient the reader to the edge where all true inquiry becomes alive again. The edge where inherited meaning loosens. The edge where direct contact begins to outrun the structures that once claimed to govern it. The edge where one realizes that what is most foundational can be pointed to, entered, and recognized, but never fully contained by the derivatives that arise from it. This is why what follows in this text must be read differently than ordinary books. It is not meant to be consumed only through conceptual analysis. It is meant to be entered as a living recognition structure. Not because it rejects thought, but because it knows thought's place. Not because it rejects meaning, but because it sees where meaning begins. Not because it rejects explanation, but because it knows that explanation is not the first movement of reality. There comes a point where meaning can no longer lead, where the mind, having refined its structures, reaches a limit, not of intelligence, but of representation. Where what is being encountered is no longer something that can be fully described, only recognized. This is not the end of knowing. It is the beginning of direct contact. Here, experience is no longer filtered through explanation first. It is met directly, and meaning follows behind as an echo. This is the threshold. Chapter 1, The Collapse of the False Sequence. The assumption is simple, ancient, and almost entirely invisible to the ordinary mind. It is the assumption that reality exists first as a finished thing, then experience happens afterward as a kind of passive reception, and then interpretation comes later as a secondary act of thought. First there is the world. Then there is the experience of the world. Then there is the meaning assigned to the experience. This sequence appears so obvious that it is rarely questioned. It feels rational. It feels orderly. It feels like common sense. It gives the impression that reality stands over here in its completed form, waiting to be encountered by an observer who later thinks about it. But this entire arrangement is more fabrication than fact. It is the product of a downstream interpretive habit that mistakes its own simplifications for the original structure of things. The correction is not that reality disappears. The correction is that the sequence collapses. There is no clean line where a fully independent reality waits to be passively received, then later enters a separate chamber called experience, then later still is translated into meaning. This is not how the living event unfolds. This is how the mind explains the event after it has already happened. It is a retrospective ordering imposed upon something that does not occur in pieces. What is called reality, what is called experience, and what is called interpretation are not three self-standing compartments that take turns. They are one movement viewed through different distinctions. They are one event rendered into separate conceptual layers only after the fact. There is only appearance. There is only recognition. There is only stabilization. Not steps. Not stages. Not a ladder. A single movement seen from different angles. This chapter begins here because almost everything distorted in the human relationship to truth begins with false sequencing. The mind assumes that what appears is already fully there as a complete and independent object, that experience merely receives it, and that interpretation is just a bonus layer added on top. But this is exactly backward. What appears is never separate from the conditions through which it appears. Recognition is never separate from what is recognized. Stabilization is never separate from the living movement that gives rise to it. The appearance of sequence is a product of meaning trying to sort what was originally inseparable. Appearance is the first word, but even the word first is already dangerous here, because it implies chronology where there is really only immediacy. Appearance does not mean a pre-existing object entering a neutral container. Appearance means the arising of something as present. It means that something has become available. Something has entered the field. Something has shown itself. Yet even here, what is showing itself cannot be separated from the conditions of showing. It is not a thing floating in abstract space, later visited by awareness. It is showing up within a field of possible contact. It is appearing as appearance. The very fact that it appears means that the event is already more relational than object-based. A thing that appears has already entered the economy of awareness. It has already become part of a living event. Recognition is not subsequent in the simplistic sense. It is not a later layer of commentary placed on top of an already complete appearance. Recognition is the instant in which appearance becomes something rather than undifferentiated contact. Recognition is the system's direct registration that what is present is not only present, but legible in some way. It is not full conceptual explanation. It is not yet mature interpretation. It is not yet the stabilization of a final meaning. It is the immediate fact that appearance has become knowable enough to register. This is why recognition feels so direct. It is not thought in the ordinary sense. It is not philosophy. It is not doctrine. It is the act by which what appears becomes distinguishable enough to be met as something at all. Stabilization then follows, though even the word follows is already a compromise made by language. Stabilization is the moment where the fluidity of recognition is rendered into enough coherence that it can persist as meaning, memory, orientation, symbol, or interpretation. Stabilization is where the system says, in effect, this is what this was. This is what I am seeing. This is how it fits. This is what it means. Stabilization is necessary. Without it there would be no continuity, no communicability, no integration, no learning, no narrative, no action based on structured understanding. Yet stabilization is not primary. It is not the source. It is the downstream firming of what was already alive as appearance and recognition. It is the point where fluidity becomes form. The false sequence tells the mind that these are separate steps, but they are not separate. They are one continuous act. Appearance is already infused with the possibility of recognition. Recognition is already inseparable from the movement toward stabilization. Stabilization is already carrying within it the residue of the original appearance. The whole thing is a loopless loop. A dynamic unity that the mind only later slices into stages so it can talk about it. This matters because once the false sequence is believed, the mind begins to live as though interpretation were optional and neutral. It imagines that it first encounters raw reality and then later adds meaning to it. But this creates a profound blindness. It hides the fact that what appears is already inseparable from how the system is able to register it. It hides the intimacy between seeing and shaping. It hides the role of perception in the birth of meaning. It hides the non-separation of the event itself. Once this blindness is in place, the system begins to treat its stabilized interpretations as if they were simply the world. It forgets the living movement by which the world became experienceable in the first place. This is why so much of ordinary life feels rigid, stale, and self-sealing. The stabilized layer has been mistaken for the source. The world, as interpreted, has been mistaken for reality itself. The human system begins defending its meanings as though they were not meanings at all, but direct revelations of the real. It forgets that appearance and recognition were ever part of the process. It believes only in the final object and the final conclusion. It speaks in settled categories. It lives in hardened symbols. It argues from fixed forms. And in doing so, it loses intimacy with the fact that all of those forms emerged from a prior fluid movement that never actually stopped. What appears is not separate from how it is known. This statement is not subjectivism. It is not the claim that there is no reality beyond the observer. It is a statement about the mechanics of experience. What appears cannot be divorced from the conditions by which it becomes appearance at all. The human system does not encounter pure reality in some untouched, unmediated state and then simply lay a knowledge on top like frosting on a cake. The system meets what appears through perception, through prior distinctions, through sensitivity, through context, through the available aperture of awareness. This does not mean reality is invented by the observer. It means appearance is always relational. It means the fact of something showing up is already a meeting, not a passive data transfer between separate domains. What is known is not separate from how it is shaped. This is equally essential. Knowing is not a detached mirror. It is not a sterile photographic reproduction of an object that remains untouched by the act of knowing. Knowing itself is formative. To know something is already to have entered a shaping relation with it. Not because the knower controls the thing, but because knowing involves selection, distinction, emphasis, relational placement, and stabilization. To know is to bring something into a usable and meaningful contour. Even the simplest act of saying what something is has already shaped its place in the world of the one who knows it. This shaping is not an error. It is unavoidable. The error begins only when shaping is forgotten and the shaped result is mistaken for the untouched source. This is why the chapter is named as it is. The false sequence must collapse. Not because sequence is always false in practical life. Time order still exists in many ordinary operations. Cause and effect still function. Learning still unfolds. Processes still have rhythm. But the false sequence being collapsed here is the assumption that reality, experience, and interpretation are cleanly separable domains lined up like train cars. That assumption must die if deeper seeing is to begin, because as long as that assumption remains in place, the human being will continue defending stabilized meanings as if they were primary, continue treating appearance as if it were a fully independent object, and continue misunderstanding the entire nature of awareness as something secondary instead of something woven into the event from the beginning. The collapse of the false sequence restores immediacy. It restores intimacy with the event. It restores the fact that knowing is alive. It restores the fact that reality as experienced is not a dead object encountered by a neutral observer, but a living field in which appearance, recognition, and stabilization continually arise together. This does not weaken rigor, it strengthens it. Because once the false sequence collapses, the system becomes far more careful about what it calls truth. It sees that stabilized meaning is not identical with the source. It sees that recognition has a different flavor than interpretation. It sees that appearance itself has already entered the field of relation. It learns to distinguish more cleanly between direct contact and downstream explanation. It becomes less likely to worship its own symbols. Less likely to confuse categories with reality. Less likely to pretend that final conclusions are ever truly final. The system grows more coherent not by abandoning thought, but by seeing where thought belongs in the larger movement. Appearance, recognition, stabilization, one movement, one unfolding, one event whose distinctions are real, but whose separations are conceptual. This is the correction. This is the collapse. And from here, a different order of seeing becomes possible. Chapter 2. The Triadic Engine of Experience. Not duality, not opposition, not the crude split between subject and object that the ordinary mind has been trained to worship as the self-evident architecture of reality. Not observer over here and world over there, not knower on one side and known on the other, not consciousness trapped inside a private chamber while existence floats outside it as some finished and separate thing. That model is too thin, too fractured, too downstream. It mistakes the stabilized rendering of experience for the living mechanics that make experience possible in the first place. It takes what has already been divided by meaning and calls the division fundamental. It takes what has already been frozen by symbol and treats the freezing as truth. But the actual engine is triadic. Not because three is mystical for its own sake. Not because one must force sacred geometry into every structure. Not because the mind needs another symbolic pattern to become attached to. The reason the triad appears here is because the mechanics themselves demand it. 2 is insufficient. 2 immediately hardens into opposition. 2 creates the illusion of poles without the movement between them. 2 gives the mind a false binary and calls it reality. But the lived event of experience is not binary. It is not a static tension between 2 isolated things. It is a generative interplay, and that interplay requires more than 2 terms to become intelligible. The seen, the seeing, the structuring. These are not separate systems. They are 3 expressions of one process. The seen is what appears. Not what is already fully defined, not what has been completely interpreted, not what has been conceptually stabilized into a final object, but what appears. What enters. What becomes available. What shows up in the field of contact as presence. A color. A sound. A sensation. A thought. A memory. A face. A pattern. A movement. A possibility. The seen is not yet the final meaning of the thing. It is the appearing of the thing. It is the event of presence before the system has fully finished telling itself what, exactly, the appearance is supposed to mean. The seeing is the act of appearance itself. Not an object. Not an entity. Not a hidden little observer sitting behind the eyes performing a secret act of looking. The seeing is not a character. It is the happening of the event. It is the fact that something is appearing at all. It is the active living contact by which the field is not blank but alive with presentation. The seeing is not a separate actor acting upon the seen from some distant chamber. It is the dynamism of manifestation within experience itself. It is the event that makes appearance appearance. The structuring is what stabilizes the event into something usable. It is what takes the fluidity of the appearing and begins the work of making it legible. It is not merely thought in the shallow sense. It is deeper and more immediate than articulated reasoning. It is the organizing principle, the shaping mechanism, the movement through which what appears becomes distinguishable, orientable, meaningful enough to hold together as a world. Structuring includes perception, emphasis, differentiation, pattern recognition, salience assignment, proto-meaning, and eventually the more formed layers of interpretation and symbolic articulation. It is the great stabilizer without which the seen would remain unworkable and the seeing would remain ungraspable. These 3 are not lined up in sequence like parts of a machine assembled one after another. They arise together. This is why the engine is triadic. What appears cannot become appearance without the event of appearing. What appears cannot become usable without structuring. The event of appearing cannot be known without something appearing. The event of appearing cannot become distinguishable without structuring. Structuring cannot operate in empty abstraction. It requires the appearing of something and the fact that something is there to be rendered. So the triad is not a stack, it is a mutual emergence. The ordinary mind wants to turn this into a sequence because sequences are easier to control conceptually. It wants to say first there is a thing, then there is an act of seeing it, then there is a thought about it. But this is another version of the false sequence collapsed in the previous chapter. The triad does not work like that. The event is more immediate, more intimate, and more inseparable. As soon as the seen appears, the seeing is already happening. As soon as the seeing is happening, structuring is already operative enough to make the event distinguishable at all. Even if the meaning is not yet fully formed, the structuring process is underway. Otherwise there would be no legibility, no orientation, no recognition, no usable world. This is why this threefold operation is the minimum viable structure of experience. Remove the seen, and nothing appears. Not because the field disappears metaphysically, but because there is no appearing to register, no presentation, no content, no event of presence. Without the seen, the possibility of experience as lived contact is absent. There is no thing entering the field. There is no arising. There is no world in motion. There is no presentable content through which awareness can become aware in any operational sense. Remove the seeing, and nothing is experienced as appearing. There may be all the conceptual talk in the universe about objects or signals or physical conditions, but without the event of appearing, none of it enters lived reality. Without the seeing, the field never becomes alive as contact. It remains a theoretical description without presence. The seeing is what makes the event experiential rather than merely postulated. It is the difference between saying something exists and having it actually arise as lived appearance. Remove the structuring, and nothing becomes usable. This is the great overlooked truth. The romantic mind loves to pretend that pure awe experience alone is enough, but without structuring there is no distinction, no orientation, no relevance, no continuity, no world. There may be intensity. There may be flood. There may be rawness. But there is no usable experience. It does not become a stable field of relation. It does not become navigable. It does not become meaningful enough to support action, learning, memory, communication, or further recognition. Without structuring, the seen and the seeing remain unformed potential in active contact, but they do not become reality as the system can inhabit it. This is why the triad is not decorative philosophy. It is operational necessity. It is the bare minimum the system requires to have experience at all. Not experience as theory. Not experience as mystical abstraction. Experience as actual lived event. The seen gives the event its appearing content. The seeing gives the event its living actuality. The structuring gives the event its usable coherence. This is not duality, because duality immediately splits the system into adversarial poles. It suggests the observer and the observed are fundamentally separate and then forces the mind to invent bridges between them. It begins from fracture and then tries to repair it conceptually. But the triadic engine starts earlier than fracture. It does not posit isolated entities first. It begins from process. It begins from the event itself. It begins from the living intimacy in which what appears, the fact of appearance, and the shaping of appearance are already intertwined. There is no need to create a bridge between what was never fully separate in the first place. This is also why the triadic engine clarifies why meaning is both essential and secondary. Meaning in its fuller articulated sense is downstream of structuring, but structuring itself already contains the proto-meaning necessary for experience to become legible. This is where many systems collapse into confusion. They assume meaning is either everything or nothing. Either they reduce all reality to interpretation, or they imagine experience can remain pure somehow bypassing all form-giving processes. Both are errors. The triadic engine shows the more accurate structure. There is a shaping movement built into the event itself. This shaping is not yet full-blown conceptual doctrine, but neither is it blank chaos. It is the intermediate operation by which appearance becomes distinguishable enough to be lived. This intermediate operation is why a child can distinguish without yet possessing mature symbolic meaning. The child sees. The seen appears. The seeing is active. Structuring is operative enough to distinguish this from that, face from wall, warmth from cold, mother from not mother, danger from safety, rhythm from disruption. Full conceptual naming may lag far behind, but the shaping process is already alive. This is why experience is never simply raw. It is always already being given contour. The contour may be minimal, fluid, pre-verbal, and open, but contour exists. Without it, there is no world, only undifferentiated intensity with no relation. This is also why two people can encounter the same event and live in different worlds. The seen overlaps. The seeing overlaps as an active appearance, but the structuring differs. One emphasizes threat, another possibility. One perceives insult, another pain. One sees closure, another invitation. One stabilizes one kind of meaning, another a wholly different one. The divergence is not because one of them invented an entirely separate universe from nothing. It is because the triadic engine is alive, and the shaping layer is not identical across systems. The same appearing content can be stabilized differently because structuring is conditioned, patterned, historical, responsive, and variable. This is why perception matters so much. Perception is not an optional lens laid on top of an already finished event. It is part of the structuring movement built into the triad itself. This also reveals why recognition is so crucial. Recognition is the point where the triad tightens into coherence. Something appears. The event of appearing is alive. Structuring stabilizes enough legibility that the system can say, in effect, this. not necessarily in words, not yet in doctrine, not yet as a finished concept, but in a direct enough way that what appears has become real as something. Recognition is what prevents the triad from remaining diffuse. It is where the seen, the seeing, and the structuring converge into an actionable moment of contact. That is why recognition feels like a threshold. It is where the engine catches. This also shows why distortion is always a problem of structuring, not of the seen or the seeing in isolation. The seen may appear as it appears, the seeing may faithfully present the fact of appearance. But if structuring is rigid, fragmented, wounded, over-defended, over-symbolized, prematurely closed, or addicted to inherited categories, then the event hardens into distortion. The problem is not that the world is there or that appearance happens. The problem is how the appearing is being stabilized into something. This is why coherent systems are so rare. Coherence requires the structuring layer to be clear enough, permeable enough, and responsive enough to allow the seen and the seeing to remain in living relation rather than being prematurely frozen into dead forms. This is the thermodynamic implication of the triad. A system remains viable to the degree that the triadic engine is coherent. If the seen is habitually reduced, narrowed, or amputated by over-rigid structuring, the system loses contact with reality. If the seeing is denied, numbed, or abstracted away into sterile conceptuality, the system loses aliveness. If structuring becomes chaotic, incoherent, or overly delayed, the system loses usability. A sustainable system requires all three to remain in dynamic relation. Appearance must be allowed. The event of appearing must remain alive. The shaping layer must stabilize without imprisoning. That is the minimum viable structure not only of experience, but of experience that can remain coherent over time. This is why the triad must be seen as one process. The seen is not independent from the seeing is not independent from the structuring is not independent from the seen. Each implies the others. Each is incomplete without the others. Each is one face of a single movement that the mind later slices apart so it can talk about it. But the slicing is not the source. The source, if one must use that word, is the living engine itself. The seen, the seeing, the structuring. Three expressions, one process, not duality, not opposition, but the triadic engine through which the world becomes experienceable, distinguishable, and usable at all. This is the minimum viable structure of experience. And once this is seen, a vast amount of confusion begins to fall away, because what once looked like separate domains, world, awareness, interpretation, begin to reveal themselves as the inseparable mechanics of one living event. Chapter 3, The Shaping Layer, Perception Revealed. Between raw contact and stable meaning lies the most powerful layer, perception. This is where so much of reality, as it is lived, is actually formed into the world the system can inhabit. Not formed in the sense of manufacturing the universe from nothing. Not formed in the sense of inventing physical existence by private imagination. But formed in the lived and operational sense that what becomes real to the system passes through this shaping layer first. Perception is the hidden workshop in which appearance becomes world. It is the silent architecture that determines how the raw fact of contact is translated into an experience that can be recognized, organized, acted upon, defended, feared, loved, avoided, or integrated. Perception is not passive. This must be stated with absolute clarity. Because one of the deepest errors in ordinary human thought is the assumption that perception is simply a camera, a neutral recorder, a transparent window, a harmless relay between world and mind. It is none of those things. A camera receives. A recorder stores. A window lets light through. Perception does something more intimate and more consequential. Perception selects. Perception emphasizes. Perception excludes. Perception contrasts. Perception organizes. Perception anticipates. Perception waits. Perception bends the raw field of contact into a pattern the system can live inside. This does not make perception false by default. It makes it formative. Perception is not neutral. It cannot be. Neutrality would imply that the whole field enters awareness with equal force, equal significance, equal visibility, equal relevance, equal interpretive possibility. But this never happens. The system is always already prioritizing. It is always already filtering. It is always already deciding, often before conscious thought even begins, what is signal and what is noise, what matters and what does not, what is near and what is irrelevant, what is dangerous and what can be ignored, what is beautiful and what is forgettable, what fits and what threatens the current structure of meaning. Even before language arrives, even before full concepts form, perception has already started shaping the event. This is why perception sits between raw contact and stable meaning as the most powerful layer. Raw contact alone is not yet a lived world. Stable meaning alone is already downstream. Perception is the living intermediary. It is the passage between openness and form. It is the shaping of potential into experience. Not potential in the simplistic sense of something imaginary waiting to become real, but potential in the sense that any given contact contains many possible routes of stabilization. The world appears. But what the world becomes to a system depends on how perception shapes that appearance before meaning hardens it. This is the layer where divergence begins. The same event can unfold through different perceptual configurations and become radically different realities to different systems. The event itself may remain the same at the level of shared conditions. The room is the same room. The sentence spoken is the same sentence. The weather, the look on a face, the silence after a conversation, the delay in a reply, the challenge at work, the pattern in a text, the line in scripture, the sound in a piece of music, the shift in a relationship, the glance from a stranger, the collapse of a plan, the emergence of a new insight. All of these may arise as the same basic occurrence. Yet what they become in lived experience can vary enormously. Not because reality is infinitely random, and not because truth is subjective in the shallow sense, but because perception is the shaping layer that determines which possibilities in the event become real to the system. This is why perception is the great distributor of worlds. Not physical worlds in the cosmic sense, but lived worlds in the experiential sense. Perception determines whether a challenge becomes threat or initiation. Whether ambiguity becomes terror or possibility. Whether silence becomes abandonment or spaciousness. Whether contradiction becomes collapse or invitation to refine. Whether another person's behavior becomes insult, evidence, mystery, sadness, projection, or pattern. Meaning later stabilizes the result, but perception is where the route is selected. This is also why perception is so easy to miss. The human system usually notices the event and then notices the meaning. It sees what happened and then what it thinks it means. But perception itself is often hidden because it operates in the middle space, between contact and concept. It is so immediate that it is mistaken for reality itself. The system does not usually say, "My perception shaped this event into this version of experience." It says, "This is what happened." It speaks as though the finished interpretation were simply the event. It forgets the shaping layer. It forgets the filter. It forgets the aperture. It forgets the active role of its own lensing. And because it forgets this, it begins living inside worlds it thinks are self-evident when in fact they have been perceptually rendered. This is why perception is not merely one mechanism among many. It is the leverage point. Change the meanings while perception remains fixed, and the system finds a way to recreate the same world under new vocabulary. Change the external environment while perception remains fixed, and the same patterns re-emerge in a different setting. Change goals, identities, social groups, ideologies, even life circumstances, while the shaping layer remains substantially unchanged, and the system often continues reproducing the same experiential dynamics. Why? Because perception is what determines which version of contact becomes experience in the first place. Meaning is downstream enough that it can be changed superficially while the deeper root remains intact. Perception is the decisive turn. The shaping layer is also why children and adults do not live in the same world even when they stand in the same room. A child can contact a world saturated with distinction while still having minimal stable meaning. Shapes, tones, rhythms, distances, warmth, intensity, movement, faces, softness, disruption, recurrence, all of this is being registered. But the structuring is more fluid, less overcoded, less symbolically burdened, less frozen into rigid categories. This is why the child seems to inhabit a wider field of potential even while lacking mature interpretive frameworks. The world has not yet been overstabilized into hardened meanings. The shaping layer is more open, more responsive, less fully colonized by inherited symbolic fixations. It is not empty. It is not neutral. It is alive with differentiation. But it is less rigidly overdetermined. As conditioning deepens, perception narrows. Not because narrowing is always bad. Narrowing is also what allows function. But when narrowing becomes over-identified with truth, the shaping layer turns from a living intermediary into an invisible prison. The system no longer knows it is shaping. It believes it is simply seeing what is there. This is the moment where distortion becomes almost inevitable, because the active nature of perception has vanished from awareness. The person now confuses their way of seeing with reality itself. This is why perception can distort without lying. It does not need to invent a false world from nowhere. It only needs to overemphasize, underregister, prematurely stabilize, or filter in a way that narrows the field beyond what coherence can sustain. A person does not need to hallucinate in order to be profoundly misled. They only need perception to keep routing events through defensive, rigid, wounded, inherited, or over-symbolized patterns. The event remains the event. But the version of the event that becomes real to the system becomes increasingly detached from the deeper field of relation within which the event actually occurred. This is why perception matters more than opinion. Opinions are often just the verbal surface of deeper perceptual shaping. People argue about beliefs while never questioning the lens that made those beliefs feel obvious in the first place. They debate conclusions while ignoring the route by which the conclusion became inevitable to them. They try to correct thought while leaving untouched the shaping layer from which the thought emerged. This is one of the reasons so much human discourse feels trapped. The fight is happening too late in the chain. By the time the argument appears, perception has already done most of its work. Perception is also why recognition is possible. Recognition does not emerge from meaning alone. Meaning often comes too late and is too slow. Recognition arises when perception shapes contact into enough legibility that something can become directly known before it is fully conceptualized. Recognition is the instant where the shaping layer does not merely filter but reveals. It allows what appears to become visible as something without yet reducing it to dead explanation. This is one of perception's highest functions. It is not only the mechanism by which distortion enters. It is also the mechanism by which the veil can thin. This means perception is dangerous and sacred at once. Dangerous because if it remains unconscious, it governs reality from the shadows and stabilizes distorted worlds as though they were truth. Sacred because if it becomes conscious, it becomes the opening through which more of reality can actually enter. Perception is the shaping layer between raw contact and stable meaning. And for that reason it determines the range of reality a system can live within. It is not the creator of existence. It does not fabricate the cosmos. It does not make something true by wishing it so. But it does determine which version of reality becomes real to the system. That statement must be held in full seriousness, because it means that most human beings are not primarily living in the world. They are living in a perceptual rendering of the world that has become so ambient, so repeated, and so unquestioned that it no longer appears as rendering. This is why the work of transformation is not first the changing of beliefs. It is not first the changing of vocabulary. It is not first the changing of identity, affiliation, or philosophical allegiance. It is first the revealing of the shaping layer. The system must come to see that it is seeing through a lens, and that the lens is active. It must notice how emphasis is assigned. It must feel how anticipation influences contact. It must see what kinds of events are being overcoded, what kinds of possibilities are being filtered out before they even arrive, what kind of worlds are being stabilized through the shaping of raw potential into the same familiar experiential forms. Once this is noticed, the whole architecture of life begins to change, because now the leverage point has become visible. The question is no longer only, what happened? The question becomes, how did perception shape what happened into this version of reality? And then, more radically still, what else was possible in this same event that my system did not allow itself to see? This is the opening, not to fantasy, not to arbitrariness, but to a wider field of contact. Perception does not create reality. It determines which version of reality becomes real to the system. That is its power. That is its danger. That is its holiness. And that is why, between raw contact and stable meaning, no layer is more consequential than this one. Perception is the shaping layer. Perception is the great selector. Perception is the hidden sculptor of the lived world. And once it is revealed, nothing ever appears quite the same again. Chapter 4, Potential is not elsewhere. Potential is one of the most misunderstood words in the entire architecture of experience. The ordinary mind hears the word and immediately imagines distance. It imagines a place before things. A hidden chamber. A waiting room of unrealized futures. A storehouse of what might one day become actual if the right conditions arise. It imagines potential as a category outside reality, as though reality were one thing and potential were another, as though the real were here and the possible were somewhere else, hovering beyond the edge of form. But this is already a distortion generated by downstream meaning. It is a symbolic convenience, not a faithful rendering of what is actually happening. Potential is not before reality. Potential is not outside reality. Potential is not waiting somewhere hidden. Potential is not a separate domain in which the unreal sits patiently until the real invites it in. Potential is not a ghostly warehouse of futures. Potential is not a mystical reserve tank of possibilities standing apart from the living field. These images are products of a mind trying to spatialize something that is not fundamentally spatial. The mind wants to locate everything. It wants to ask where the possible is, where it sits, when it begins, when it becomes real. But potential does not behave like an object, and so the attempt to pin it down as if it were a hidden thing already loses the thread. Potential is what has not yet been stabilized into distinction. This is the correction. Potential is not unreality. It is not non-existence. It is not a deficiency of form waiting to be fixed. It is the unresolved openness within the real before a specific contour has been locked into place. It is the not yet distinguished field of what can become legible under particular conditions of perception, structuring, recognition, and meaning. Potential is not elsewhere because it is already here, woven into every living event that has not yet exhausted the range of what it may become to a system. Potential is not outside the present. It is the uncollapsed range within the present. This is why every moment is saturated with unresolved patterns. Not because reality is vague in a careless sense. Not because nothing means anything. Not because the world is infinitely arbitrary. But because what appears in any moment always exceeds the single stabilized meaning the system first extracts from it. The event is richer than the first reading. The contact contains more than the first interpretation. The world presents layers, tensions, trajectories, echoes, resonances, relations, ambiguities, implications, and distinctions that have not all been selected at once. A moment is never just one thing in the beginning. It becomes one thing to a system through collapse into legibility. Until then, it remains saturated with more than one stabilized root. Potential therefore is the unresolved multiplicity built into the living event before the shaping layer has finalized which version of the event becomes real to the system. This is why every moment is also saturated with unselected interpretations. This must be understood carefully. Interpretation is not some artificial imposition unrelated to the real. Interpretation is part of the lived mechanics by which the world becomes usable. Yet no event arrives carrying only one inevitability. The event enters a field of possible shaping. Fear may be one route. Wonder another. Injury one route. Invitation another. Closure one route. Initiation another. Insult one route. Pain another. Proof one route. Mystery another. These are not all equally coherent in every case, and this is not a lazy relativism in which anything can mean anything. Constraints remain. Reality pushes back. Truth still matters. But the route from event to lived world is not singular before the shaping layer has operated. There are unselected interpretations present in every event because the event has not yet been fully stabilized into one final meaning. This is also why every moment is saturated with unformed meaning. Meaning is not absent. It is not nothing. But before it stabilizes, it is fluid. The system is still in motion with the contact. The appearance has not yet become a fully named world. Structuring is active, but stabilization is incomplete. Meaning is coming into being. The event is being shaped. The field is moving toward coherence, toward legibility, toward the usable world. But before that movement settles, unformed meaning remains present as latent interpretive possibility. This is the fertile region in which experience is still alive enough to become more than one thing without yet becoming chaos. This is what the ordinary mind keeps missing when it imagines potential as some other place. Potential is not behind reality waiting to become real. Potential is the unresolved openness within reality before distinction has finished carving it into a singular usable form. That is why potential and distinction are so intimately linked. Distinction is not the destruction of potential. It is the stabilization of one route through it. This matters, because many systems either idolize potential and fear form, or idolize form and fear potential. Both are distortions. A system trapped in pure openness without stabilization cannot act. A system trapped in overstabilization loses permeability to the real. Potential without distinction remains unusable. Distinction without potential becomes dead. Life requires the interplay. The field remains rich because potential is present. The world becomes inhabitable because distinction occurs. But the distinction should never be mistaken for the exhaustion of the field from which it arose. Perception is what mediates this movement. Perception does not access potential. It collapses it into experience. This sentence must be held with exactness, because it overturns an enormous amount of confusion. The mind often imagines perception as a passive tunnel into an already separated realm of possibilities, as though potential were sitting somewhere waiting to be reached, and perception merely opened the door. But this is not what perception is doing. Perception is not visiting an external warehouse of the possible. Perception is the shaping mechanism by which unresolved openness becomes a specific experiential world. Perception does not browse possibilities the way a consumer browses products. Perception selects, emphasizes, filters, stabilizes, and makes real to the system one route through the unresolved field. This is why perception is not merely observational, it is generative in the lived sense. Again, not generative in the naive sense of fabricating physical reality from imagination, but generative in the precise sense that it determines how unresolved potential becomes actualized as experience. Perception is not a camera taking pictures of finished existence. Perception is a collapse mechanism. It takes the unresolved richness of what appears and shapes it into the version of the event the system can live inside. That is why perception has so much leverage. It does not merely report the world. It determines which world in the event becomes the world for that system. This is why two people can stand in the same room, hear the same sentence, and walk away living in different realities. The event was shared. The unresolved field was shared. The available constraints were shared. But the collapse was different. Perception stabilized different distinctions, and therefore different realities became real to each system. This is not because one of them created a separate universe. It is because potential was not elsewhere waiting to be found, it was present in the event as unresolved openness, and perception shaped it differently into experience. This is also why the shaping layer matters more than people realize. They believe they are reacting to what is, but often they are reacting to what their perception has already collapsed the event into. They defend their stabilized version of reality as though it were the only thing that was ever there. They argue for meanings that feel final because the collapse into experience was so immediate they forgot it was a collapse at all. They do not perceive the unresolved field that existed a moment earlier. They do not perceive the unselected interpretations, the unformed meanings, the unrealized roots, the wider range of what the event could have become under a different aperture. And because they do not perceive that, they mistake their version of the world for the world itself. This is one of the root mechanics of distortion. Distortion is not always the invention of something false from nothing. More often it is the premature hardening of one collapse into totality. It is the forgetting that potential was present. It is the forgetting that the event exceeded the first stabilization. It is the forgetting that what became real to the system was one route through the field, not the exhaustion of the field. Once this forgetting takes hold, the system begins defending its collapsed world as though truth itself were identical with the first form that became legible. That is how rigid ideologies emerge. That is how relationships become trapped in repetitive misreadings. That is how entire civilizations 54 inside extractive interpretations of reality without sensing the broader field from which those interpretations arose. The collapse has become invisible, so the result feels absolute. This is why recognition is so transformative. Recognition is not just the noticing of what is already stabilized. Recognition can also reveal the unresolved field again. It can show the system that what felt final was only a first collapse. It can reopen the event. It can reveal that more was there than the first meaning allowed. That is why real recognition often feels like waking up. Not because something was added from outside, but because something that was present in unresolved form becomes available again before being prematurely sealed. This is also why allowance matters. Allowance is not passivity. It is not indifference. It is not refusing to distinguish. Allowance is what permits the unresolved field to remain open long enough for more of it to become legible before premature stabilization closes the event down. The fragmented observer rushes to meaning because uncertainty feels threatening. But the one who can allow does not collapse the field too quickly. They let perception widen before stabilization hardens. They let more of the unresolved pattern remain alive. And because of that, the experience that emerges is often richer, more coherent, and less distorted. Potential is therefore not a mystical abstraction and not an elsewhere. It is the inherent openness within every living event before that event has been fully carved into a singular form. This is why every moment is inexhaustible relative to the first thing the mind says about it. Not infinitely in the sloppy sense that anything can be projected onto it, but inexhaustible in the precise sense that reality exceeds its first stabilization. That excess is potential. That unresolved richness is potential. That field of unselected but not unreal roots is potential. And perception is what determines how that potential becomes real as experience. This is also why reality and possibility are not enemies. Possibility is not opposed to the real. Possibility is the unresolved dimension of the real prior to collapse into singular distinction. Once this is understood, the world changes, not because the external environment magically transforms, but because the system stops treating its first stabilization as the whole truth of the event. It becomes more careful, more open, more coherent, more honest about the fact that what appears first is not necessarily all that was present. It becomes aware of collapse. It becomes aware of shaping. It becomes aware that lived reality is not a passive copy of a finished world, but an active stabilization of the unresolved field into experience. Potential is not before reality. Potential is not outside reality. Potential is not waiting somewhere hidden. Potential is what has not yet been stabilized into distinction. Every moment is saturated with unresolved patterns, unselected interpretations, and unformed meaning. Perception does not access potential. It collapses it into experience. And once this is seen, the entire world reveals itself as more alive, more open, more dynamic, and more ethically demanding than the fragmented mind ever imagined, because what one collapses into reality is never trivial. It becomes the world one inhabits. Chapter 5, Distinction as Creation. Creation is not making something from nothing. This must be cleared first because the human imagination is addicted to dramatic origin stories. It wants the impossible spectacle. It wants absolute void on one side and fully formed reality on the other. It wants creation to mean conjuring, summoning, manufacturing, producing an object where no possibility whatsoever had previously been present. But this image is downstream fantasy. It is a symbolic exaggeration generated by a mind that no longer knows how to perceive process. It treats emergence like magic because it has lost intimacy with the quiet mechanics by which form actually comes into being. Creation, in the more exact sense, is not the fabrication of existence from non-existence. Creation is bringing distinction to what was previously undifferentiated. This is the living core. What is called created is not necessarily unreal before it is formed, nor fully real in the same sense after it is formed. It is better understood as a route through potential becoming stabilized into distinct appearance. Before distinction, there is no usable thing, no formed contour, no stable edge, no nameable shape, no inhabitable object in the experiential sense. There is openness. There is unresolved field. There is latent pattern. There is possibility not yet given the specific contour by which a system could live inside it as this rather than that. Creation is the act by which that contour arrives. This is why distinction and creation are inseparable. A thing becomes a thing because it has been distinguished. A form becomes form because some boundary, however fluid or subtle, has stabilized enough for legibility. A meaning becomes meaningful because it has been differentiated from other possible meanings. A path becomes an actual path because other possibilities are no longer equally alive within the event. Distinction is not merely a labeling after the fact. It is the mechanism by which potential enters the realm of usable form. Without distinction, creation never becomes experiential. Without distinction, reality may still be in motion, but it is not yet given as a world the system can inhabit. This is why what is called new is so often misunderstood. The ordinary mind thinks in opposites. Either something existed already and was merely found, or it did not exist and was invented. Either it was discovered whole, waiting somewhere hidden, or it was made up from nothing. But this binary is too crude for the actual mechanics. What is called new is not invented in the sense of arbitrary fabrication, and it is not retrieved in the sense of taking a finished object down from a shelf where it had been stored in completed form. What is called new is stabilized. It is a possibility brought into distinct, coherent, inhabitable contour. It was not previously this. Yet it was not absolute nothing either. It existed as unresolved potential within a larger field that had not yet been collapsed into this particular form. This is why creation feels paradoxical to the ordinary mind. It senses that something genuine has emerged. It feels the force of novelty. It recognizes that something is here now that was not here in this way before. Yet if it looks carefully, it also senses that the new thing did not come from nowhere. It came through pattern, through relation, through latent structure, through converging conditions, through the opening of a route that had not yet been stabilized. Thus creation feels like both discovery and generation at once because it is neither of those in their simplistic forms. It is not mere retrieval. It is not sheer invention. It is the stabilization of a viable distinction within a field that had not previously held that distinction in formed actuality. This is why melody is created rather than merely found, and yet it is not random nonsense drawn from a void. The space of musical possibility is already there as latent pattern, interval, resonance, rhythm, relation. But the melody itself does not exist as a finished object until one route through that potential is stabilized into sequence. The same is true of language, mathematics, architecture, science, philosophy, art, love, civilization, memory, identity, and even the ordinary event of a thought becoming clear. The possibility space is not nothing. The final distinction is not already fully there. Creation occurs where the root becomes form. This is why distinction is not merely analytical. It is generative. The fragmented observer imagines distinction only as separation, classification, division, carving the world up into rigid parts. But distinction at its root is more than division. Distinction is the emergence of identifiable form within a field that has not yet finished becoming. It is the difference between pure unresolved openness and a world that can actually be lived, recognized, and acted within. Distinction does not only separate. It births. It does not only categorize. It reveals. It does not only break apart. It makes legible. This is why distinction, properly understood, is one of the most sacred operations in the architecture of experience. It is the threshold where potential ceases to remain only possible and becomes actual as something. This is also why the fear of distinction is as distorted as the worship of it. If one fears distinction entirely, one imagines that pure undifferentiated openness is the highest reality and that form is a fall from truth. But without distinction, nothing can be recognized, nothing can be communicated, nothing can be related to, nothing can be stabilized enough to enter lived worlds. On the other hand, if one worships distinction without remembering the field from which it arises, one freezes form into finality and mistakes temporary contour for absolute truth. The coherent path is neither collapse into undifferentiated abstraction nor imprisonment in rigid form. The coherent path recognizes distinction as the act by which creation becomes experiential while also remembering that every distinction is downstream of a wider field it does not exhaust. This is why what is called creation always carries both revelation and limitation. To distinguish one root is to reveal a form. But to reveal one form is also to leave countless other unresolved possibilities unselected within that moment. This is not a flaw. It is simply the condition of form itself. A thing becomes this because it is no longer equally all other things. A meaning becomes stable because it is no longer entirely open. A path becomes real because alternatives have ceased to be equally alive in the field. Creation therefore always includes narrowing, but it is a fruitful narrowing. It is a narrowing that makes worlds possible. Without it there is infinite openness but no inhabitable reality. With it there is a world, but also the risk that the world forgets its own origin in the unresolved field. This is why creation and collapse are so closely related to perception. Perception is one of the primary operators by which distinction happens in lived experience. It is the shaping layer that determines which possibilities in the field become actual for the system. Perception is not the source of all existence, but it is a central source of distinction in the realm of experience. What the system lives as real is not all that is possible in an event. It is what perception has stabilized into legible form. This is creation in the experiential sense. The moment becomes this conversation, this threat, this invitation, this memory, this wound, this beauty, this problem, this revelation. Not because the event had no prior structure, but because perception brought a specific distinction into stable actuality for the system. This is why human life is more creative than most humans realize. Creation is not reserved for artists, inventors, mystics, or geniuses. Creation is happening every time the system stabilizes a route through potential into lived reality. Every act of seeing, every act of naming, every act of recognition, every act of interpretation contains a creative dimension. Not in the inflated sense that the human ego manufactures the universe, but in the precise sense that the system is constantly participating in the distinction-making through which the world becomes its world. This is one of the reasons so much responsibility is hidden inside ordinary perception. The person thinks they are merely reacting to the world, when in fact they are continuously stabilizing versions of the world into actuality through the distinctions they bring forth. This also clarifies why some forms feel newly alive when first recognized. The structure may have been latent for a long time. The possibility may have been embedded in the field. The pattern may have been available in principle. Yet until the distinction is stabilized, it has not entered reality as that thing for that system. This is why a deep insight can feel simultaneously ancient and new. Ancient because the pattern was not fabricated out of nothing. New because it had never before been stabilized into that clear and distinct form within the system. This is why genuine discovery and genuine creation so often feel inseparable. They are both downstream of distinction. The same is true at larger scales. A society creates forms of life by stabilizing distinctions into institutions, values, language, laws, technologies, roles, and architectures of meaning. A civilization is not made from nothing. It arises through the repeated collapse of countless possibilities into hardened structures. Those structures then become the world subsequent generations inherit as though it had always already been there. But what one age experiences as just reality is often only a stabilized creative collapse from ages before. This is why transformation at scale requires not only changing policies or meanings, but reworking the distinctions through which a people render the world in the first place. A new world does not begin only when new slogans are spoken. It begins when different distinctions start becoming actual. This is also why coherence is the test of true creation, because not every distinction remains viable. Not every stabilization is sustainable. Some collapses are distortions. Some are too narrow, too fragile, too detached from the deeper field of relation to hold under scrutiny or over time. This is why creation cannot be romanticized as though any act of distinction were automatically aligned. Creation in the deeper sense is not merely the production of form. It is the emergence of form that can hold. Form that coheres. Form that does not instantly fracture under the weight of broader reality. Form that participates in the larger field without severing itself from it. The more coherent the distinction, the more durable the creation. The more distorted the distinction, the more quickly collapse follows. This reveals something vital. Creation is not only abundance. It is responsibility. To create is to distinguish. To distinguish is to stabilize. To stabilize is to bring a root through potential into the realm of consequence. Once a distinction hardens into actuality, it enters the field of relation. It affects the system. It changes the range of what becomes possible next. It invites reinforcement or resistance. It shapes worlds. Thus creation is not an abstract metaphysical miracle occurring far away from ordinary life. It is happening at every scale, in every moment where unresolved openness becomes form. This is why the chapter must say what it says with precision. Creation is not making something from nothing. Creation is bringing distinction to what was previously undifferentiated. What is called new is not invented, not retrieved. It is stabilized. Not because stabilization is the whole story, but because stabilization is the point where potential crosses into lived form. The root becomes actual. The contour holds. The field becomes world. The unresolved becomes distinct enough to be met. That is the birth of the created. And once this is seen, the human relationship to reality changes forever, because what had looked like a finished world now reveals itself as an ongoing event of distinction. The world is no longer a dead inventory of separate things. It becomes a living field in which form is continuously being born from openness through the act of coherent stabilization. Creation is everywhere because distinction is everywhere. And distinction is everywhere because reality, as lived, is never finished. Chapter 6, The Illusion of the Separate Observer. The seer feels like the center. This is one of the deepest and most convincing appearances in the whole architecture of experience. It does not merely appear as an idea. It appears as immediacy. It feels obvious. It feels prior to questioning. It feels like the one fact the system can trust even when everything else becomes unstable. Thoughts come and go. Sensations rise and fall. Moods shift. Identities mutate. Meanings change. Worlds collapse and rebuild. But through all of this, there seems to remain a stable interior point from which everything is being witnessed. A center. A looker. A silent someone behind the eyes. A witness standing apart from the stream, receiving it all. This feeling is so foundational to ordinary experience that most systems never question it. They build entire metaphysics, psychologies, religions, identities, moralities, and fears around this apparent center. They assume the observer is primary because the observer feels like the point from which all else is known. But upon inspection, this center begins to soften. Not because seeing disappears. Not because awareness fails. Not because experience becomes unreal. But because what once felt like a separate observer begins to reveal itself as another formation within the field rather than something standing outside it. The feeling of being a center is real as feeling. The sense of I is real as appearance. The posture of witnessing is real as an event in experience. But none of these automatically prove the existence of an independently separate operator behind the process. They only prove that the process includes a self-referential structure that feels like a center. This is the distinction that changes everything. The sense of I is itself an appearance. The feeling of observing is itself an appearance. These are not external certainties verifying an observer outside the field. They are contents within the field. They arise. They stabilize. They become familiar. They are reinforced by language, memory, identity, embodiment, continuity, and habit. But they are still appearing phenomena. They belong to the same order as the thoughts that announce them, the tensions that accompany them, the memories that reinforce them, the bodily contractions that localize them, and the narratives that stabilize them. The observer, when closely examined, does not stand outside the appearing. The observer appears. This is why the separate observer is an illusion, but not in the cheap sense of being unreal or fake. It is an illusion in the more exact sense of being a stabilized interpretation of a deeper process. Something real is happening. There is perspective. There is reflexivity. There is the sense of inwardness, of subjectivity, of self-reference, of continuity. All of that is real as process. But the system's interpretation of that reality hardens into a separate operator, and that hardening is the distortion. The process is then mistaken for an entity. The self-referential event is mistaken for an independent watcher. A living movement becomes a thing. This is one of the most subtle collapses in the whole architecture of experience, because the mind is almost incapable of talking about knowing without introducing a knower. It wants a someone behind the act. It wants a stable subject to explain the continuity of the field. It wants a little center from which the stream is managed. But when one looks directly, the evidence for this center is not the existence of some separate observer found outside the field. The evidence is only that there is a sense of center, a sense of watching, a sense of I, and all of these are appearing within the same total movement being examined. This is why the false observer survives so long. It hides in the structure of grammar. It hides in the structure of thought. It hides in the structure of memory. It hides in the structure of defense. Language keeps saying, I see. I think. I feel. I observe, and because language is built around subject-verb-object structure, the mind assumes the architecture of grammar reflects the architecture of reality. It assumes that because speech requires a subject, experience must as well. But grammar is not revelation. It is a symbolic convenience. It is one way of stabilizing a fluid event into communicable structure. And what it stabilizes is useful, but not final. The subject in language does not prove a separate subject in reality. It only proves that language has chosen a way to organize the event. Memory then reinforces the illusion further by creating continuity. The system remembers past appearances and links them through a narrative center. It says, I was there then and I am here now. It tells itself a story of enduring identity. It weaves events into a thread. This thread has tremendous functional value. It allows orientation, continuity, responsibility, relationship, learning, self-correction, planning. But again, functional value does not prove metaphysical separation. The continuity of self-reference can exist without requiring a separate operator outside the field. It only requires a sufficiently stable recursive structure through which the field refers to itself across time. This is the key. There is no external operator. There is self-referential process. This phrase must be understood in its full depth. Self-referential process means that the field of experience includes within itself the capacity to turn toward itself, to register itself, to stabilize a center-like structure within itself, to create continuity, reflexivity, and perspective without requiring a separate metaphysical observer standing apart from what is appearing. The field does not need an external witness in order to witness. Witnessing is one of its operations. It does not need a separate self in order to produce self-reference. Self-reference is one of its capacities. It does not need a detached operator behind thought in order for the sense of I to arise. The sense of I is one of the shapes the process can take. This reveals why the observer feels so convincing, because self-reference is not a trivial function. It is powerful. It produces continuity, responsibility, inwardness, narrative gravity, localization, and the felt sense of center. When the field folds back on itself in this way, the result is deeply compelling. It feels like someone. It feels like a knower. It feels like the one to whom all things are happening. But the field's ability to generate a center-like effect does not mean that effect is separate from the field. It means the field is more sophisticated than ordinary thought had previously understood. This is also why the separate observer cannot be found directly. One can find sensations, one can find thoughts, one can find emotions, one can find memories, one can find the feeling of being the witness, one can find the sense of inward location, one can find the tightening behind the eyes, the pressure in the chest, the narrative of me, the continuity of identity, the ownership impulse attached to thought and action. But the separate observer itself remains strangely absent as an object of direct finding. What appears instead are always appearances associated with the observer model. This is not accidental. It is because the observer is not a thing in addition to the field. It is the field taking a reflexive shape. The moment this begins to be seen, the architecture of experience changes. Not because the self vanishes in some dramatic or dissociative way. Not because perspective disappears. Not because ethical life becomes impossible. Not because individuality is denied. But because the hardness of separation begins to soften. The observer is no longer imagined as a little sovereign sealed off from the rest of reality, managing appearances from outside them. The observer becomes visible as one of the event's own structures. The field is not being watched by something separate from itself. The field is exhibiting the capacity to know itself from within. This is a much deeper and more coherent view. It does not flatten individuality into meaningless blur. It does not destroy practical identity. It does not erase embodied distinction. What it removes is the false metaphysical inflation of those distinctions into absolute separations. A human being can still say I and mean something operationally valid. A human being can still remember, plan, love, create, suffer, choose, learn, and speak from a locus of continuity. But the center is no longer misunderstood as an independently separate essence standing outside the field. It is understood as a stabilized self-referential pattern within it. This makes the whole system lighter, less defensive, less brittle, less desperate to maintain a proxy center as though the collapse of that center would mean the collapse of reality itself. This is also why defense diminishes when the illusion softens. A false center must defend itself constantly because it experiences everything as an external threat. It experiences contradiction as attack, uncertainty as destabilization, difference as danger, ambiguity as loss of control. It lives in the war posture because separation is its foundation. But once the observer is seen as process rather than isolated entity, much of that frantic defensive energy begins to weaken. Not because discernment disappears, but because the system no longer has to protect an imaginary metaphysical boundary with the same urgency. Regulation remains. Practical caution remains. Boundaries still exist in the functional sense, but existential defense loses some of its absolute force because the separate observer was never what it imagined itself to be. This is why the collapse of the separate observer is not annihilation. It is relief. It is the end of carrying what never needed to be carried. It is the end of treating self-reference as separation. It is the end of mistaking grammar for ontology. It is the end of defending a center that was only ever a local stabilization of the field's own reflexive intelligence. This is also where intimacy with reality deepens, because so long as the observer stands apart, all experience is filtered through an unseen division. The world is over there. The self is over here. Contact is partial. Love is partial. Fear is intensified. Meaning becomes defensive. Interpretation becomes territorial. But when the observer is seen as an appearance within the field rather than an external operator, the whole economy shifts. Contact becomes more immediate. Experience becomes less split. Distinction remains, but false separation weakens. Reality is no longer a distant object being judged by a sealed subject. It becomes a living relational event in which the self-referential movement is one expression among many. This is not the destruction of personhood. It is the purification of it. The person no longer has to pretend to be an isolated metaphysical atom. The person can be understood as a local expression of a larger living process, distinct but not separate, coherent but not sealed, self-referential but not self-originating in the isolated sense. This makes individuality more true, not less. Because what is false falls away and what remains is functional, intimate, fluid, and real. The seer feels like the center. But upon inspection, the sense of I and the feeling of observing are themselves appearances within the field. There is no external operator. There is self-referential process. This is the correction. This is the liberation. And once this is seen, the system no longer needs to keep inventing a little watcher behind the world. The world is already self-disclosing. The field is already self-referential. Experience is already alive without the fiction of an external observer standing apart from what is happening. That fiction collapses. The process remains. And what remains is far more coherent than what was lost. Chapter 7. The limit of meaning. Meaning is powerful. It is one of the great stabilizing forces in the architecture of experience. Meaning is what allows the world to become something rather than undifferentiated contact. Meaning turns the flood into form. It turns the appearing into the intelligible. It makes memory possible, communication possible, continuity possible, self-reference possible, learning possible, civilization possible. Without meaning, there would be sensation without world, contact without orientation, intensity without inhabitable structure. Meaning is what gives contour to the stream. Meaning is what allows a system not only to undergo experience, but to hold it long enough for it to become usable. Meaning organizes. Meaning differentiates. Meaning remembers. Meaning stabilizes. Meaning tells the system what a thing is, where it belongs, what it implies, what it threatens, what it offers, how it relates, and how it should be carried forward. It is one of the great engines of coherence in lived reality, because without the work of meaning there is no legibility, and without legibility there is no world. Yet meaning has a boundary. This must be seen with precision, because the ordinary mind does not easily admit it. The ordinary mind believes that if meaning is powerful enough, refined enough, subtle enough, inclusive enough, or abstract enough, then eventually it will be able to capture anything. It imagines that whatever exists can, in principle, be fully contained by the right concept, the right theory, the right language, the right symbolic arrangement. It treats meaning not merely as a tool, but as a totalizing force. It assumes that what can be approached can therefore be fully defined. It assumes that what can be pointed to can eventually be captured. It assumes that the real is only waiting for a sufficiently elegant description to become fully known. But this assumption breaks. Not because meaning is weak, because meaning is derivative. Meaning requires distinction. Meaning requires relation. Meaning requires comparison. This is the heart of the matter. Meaning cannot operate without a differentiated field. It needs this and that. It needs contrast. It needs contour. It needs some boundary, some edge, some relation, some difference through which one thing can be rendered in reference to another. Meaning is relational by its nature. A thing means something by being distinguished from what it is not, connected to what surrounds it, placed within a pattern, brought into a field of differences that makes it intelligible. Meaning is never self-standing in a vacuum. It is a function of distinctions held in relation. This is why meaning cannot fully define what gives rise to distinction itself. The source of distinction is upstream of the conditions meaning requires in order to function. Meaning can work on distinctions once they are there. It can refine them, extend them, compare them, analyze them, symbolize them, stabilize them, communicate them, build systems out of them. But the generative threshold from which distinction first becomes possible cannot be fully enclosed within the derivative mechanisms that arrive after it. Meaning can point. Meaning can circle. Meaning can approximate. Meaning can become exquisitely subtle. But meaning remains downstream from the very process it is trying to contain. This is why the source of meaning cannot be fully defined by meaning. This is not anti-intellectualism. It is not a rejection of language. It is not an argument for vagueness. It is not a sentimental celebration of mystery for its own sake. It is a structural recognition. The tool cannot entirely contain the condition of its own possibility. A derivative mechanism cannot fully stabilize that from which its derivatives emerge. Meaning is among the most powerful operations in the human system, but it is still an operation. It is not the whole. It is not the source. It is not the final authority simply because it is how the system ordinarily holds the world. This becomes easier to see when one recognizes how meaning functions at all. Meaning does not float freely. It leans on differentiation. It leans on relation. It leans on structure. It leans on stabilized perceptual and symbolic contours. Even the most abstract idea relies on some prior shaping through which the field became distinguishable enough for thought to work upon it. Meaning can only say what something is because something has already become sufficiently distinct to be said. Meaning can only define because something has already taken on enough form to be compared. Meaning can only symbolize because some event of appearance has already become stable enough to hold. Meaning is powerful, but it is not first. And because it is not first, it encounters a limit. That limit is not merely where thought becomes confused. It is where thought reaches the edge of its lawful domain. There is a difference between confusion and boundary. Confusion is when the system fails to organize clearly. Boundary is when the system discovers that its organizing mechanism does not apply in the same way beyond a certain threshold. The limit of meaning is this boundary. It is not that the source is irrational or incoherent. It is that the source cannot be fully approached through the same operations that require the source in order to exist. The issue is not that the source lacks reality. The issue is that meaning, by virtue of its dependence on distinction, cannot fully wrap itself around that which makes distinction possible in the first place. This is why all deep inquiry eventually becomes apophatic, whether it admits it or not. At the far edge of meaning, one begins to define by negation, by gesture, by relation, by approximation, by carefully saying what cannot quite be said directly. Not because the source is absent, but because direct conceptual containment breaks down. One says it is not this, not merely that, not reducible to the categories that arise from it. One points. One indicates. One approaches asymptotically. One begins to speak in ways that are more like orientation than capture. This is not a defect in intelligence. It is intelligence becoming honest about its own conditions. Thus the source of meaning can only be approached, pointed to, recognized. Approached, because the system can move nearer in coherence without fully enclosing what it approaches. Pointed to, because language can orient without pretending to contain. Recognized, because direct contact can occur even where full conceptual capture cannot. These three terms matter. Approach is the movement of refinement without possession. It is the willingness to draw near without claiming final conquest. Approach preserves humility. It allows the system to deepen without hardening into false certainty. It recognizes that nearness and containment are not the same. Pointing is the proper function of language at the edge. Language here stops pretending to be the thing and becomes what it has always secretly been, a directional structure. A pointer. A gesture. A vector of attention. Meaning, when purified, does not insist that it is the source. It says, look here. Attend to this. Notice what is prior to the word. Feel what the concept is trying to indicate without mistaking the concept for the indicated itself. Recognition is the deepest of the three. Recognition is what happens when the source is not merely theorized but met. Not fully defined, not conceptually exhausted, but directly known in the mode appropriate to what it is. Recognition does not end inquiry. It does not replace meaning. It does not magically solve the entire architecture of knowing. But it crosses a threshold meaning alone cannot cross. It allows direct contact where representation reaches its limit. This is why recognition is so central to everything in this work. It is the bridge between the derivative mechanism of meaning and the upstream reality meaning cannot fully contain. This is also why there comes a point where meaning must stop leading. Meaning is indispensable, but it is not sovereign. It can guide the system only so far before it begins mistaking its own representations for the source they arose from. When that happens, meaning becomes idolatrous. It begins worshipping its own forms. It begins defending its own symbols. It begins calling itself truth instead of admitting that it is only a powerful derivative of truth's stabilization in experience. This is the exact point where great systems go wrong. They confuse clarity with completeness. They confuse useful form with total containment. They confuse conceptual stability with ultimate reality. Once this confusion enters, the system closes too early. It no longer points. It concludes. It no longer approaches. It claims. It no longer recognizes. It merely explains. And this is where living contact dies beneath the weight of stabilized meaning. This chapter therefore is not an attack on meaning. It is a restoration of proportion. Meaning is necessary. Meaning is sacred in its proper place. Meaning gives the world its continuity and its communicability. Meaning is one of the great gifts within the architecture of awareness. But meaning is not first, and meaning is not final. There is a threshold beyond which meaning can still serve, but only if it stops pretending to contain what can only be encountered more directly. This is why the deepest truths often feel both immediately obvious and impossible to finalize. They are not opaque because they lack coherence. They are difficult to finalize because finalization is the wrong mode. They are not hidden because they are absent. They are elusive because the mind keeps trying to turn what must be recognized into what can be fully contained. They are not beyond language in the simplistic sense. They are beyond language's total jurisdiction. And this is an important distinction. Language still matters. Concepts still matter. Definitions still matter. But they matter as bridges, as structures of orientation, as partial stabilizations within a larger field. They do not matter as ultimate capture devices. Once this is understood, inquiry becomes cleaner, humbler, and more alive. One stops trying to imprison the source in derivative tools. One begins allowing the tools to do what they can do well while refusing to burden them with a task they cannot complete. This is also why the most mature relation to meaning is flexible rather than rigid. Rigid meaning tries to close the gap too early. It sees ambiguity as failure. It sees uncontainability as threat. It sees the inability to fully define as evidence of weakness or unreality. Flexible meaning is wiser. It can hold form without mistaking form for totality. It can articulate without overclaiming. It can refine without pretending to finish. It can say what is true enough to guide while remaining open to what exceeds its own current articulation. Flexible meaning is not less exact. It is more exact, because it knows its scope. This brings us back to the central fact. Meaning requires distinction, relation, comparison. But what generates distinction itself cannot be fully captured by it. Thus the source of meaning cannot be fully defined by meaning. It can only be approached, pointed to, recognized. And once this is genuinely understood, the mind becomes less arrogant, less hurried, less desperate to conclude. It becomes willing to live at the threshold where language still functions but no longer dominates, where concepts still clarify but no longer imprison, where meaning still matters but no longer claims to be the source of the reality it serves. This is the limit of meaning, not a wall, not a failure, a threshold. And beyond that threshold, knowing becomes more direct, more intimate, and more honest than the mind alone ever imagined possible. Chapter 8. The recognition threshold. There is a point where interpretation slows. Not because the system has become dull. Not because intelligence has failed. Not because language has lost all function. But because the movement of interpretation, having carried the system as far as it can through concept, symbol, sequence, and stabilized meaning, reaches a threshold where further refinement no longer leads the encounter. The ordinary order begins to reverse. The mind, which was once accustomed to going first, begins to hesitate. Language, which once rushed to define, classify, and stabilize, no longer arrives with the same authority. Explanation, which once seemed like the gateway to truth, pauses, not in collapse, but in deference. This pause is sacred, not because it is dramatic, not because it is mystical in the theatrical sense, but because it marks the moment where the system stops insisting that reality must first become explainable in order to be real. There is a point where language quiets. This does not mean silence in the absolute sense. Words may still come. Concepts may still move. The mind may still be active. But something in the system recognizes that the ordinary relation has changed. Language is no longer trying to seize the event before it arrives. It is no longer racing ahead of contact, forcing the encounter into inherited categories before the thing itself has had time to reveal its contour. The quieting of language is the quieting of premature capture. It is the softening of the compulsive need to say what this is before the reality of it has fully landed. There is a point where explanation pauses. Again, this is not anti-explanation. It is not the rejection of reason. It is not the triumph of vagueness over clarity. It is more exact than that. Explanation pauses because the system has reached an order of immediacy in which explanation would be too slow, too derivative, too late to lead. The event is already present. The thing is already touching the field. Something is already being known before the explanatory structure has completed its work. This is not irrationality. It is a prior form of contact, and recognition takes over. This is the threshold. This is the turning. Recognition does not arrive as a conclusion reached by linear sequence alone. It does not always emerge from stepwise deduction. It is not merely the final sentence of a reasoning process. Recognition is immediate in a different register. It is the direct registration of something as something before the full machinery of stabilized meaning has caught up. It is not blind. It is not arbitrary. It is not random intuition detached from structure. It is immediate because the system has encountered enough coherence in the event that what is present can no longer be held only as possibility. It has become directly knowable. This is why recognition feels different from interpretation. Interpretation works across distance. It relates, compares, names, assigns, sequences, and explains. Recognition collapses distance. It is the instant in which the event is no longer merely being processed as data but has become directly real within awareness as an undeniable contour. Recognition does not mean the system can yet explain everything it has encountered. It means the system knows enough, directly enough, that the thing has crossed from uncertainty into contact. Not conceptual, not analytical, but immediate. These phrases matter because they protect the threshold from being misunderstood. The mind often imagines that only what is analytically derived can be trusted, and so it downgrades recognition to feeling, impression, guesswork, or irrational leap. But this is too crude. Recognition is not opposed to analysis, it is simply prior to the point where analysis becomes the dominant mode. Recognition can later be examined, articulated, tested, refined, translated, and integrated. In fact, this is often necessary. But the event of recognition itself is immediate. It is what happens when the system directly meets enough of the real that it can no longer pretend nothing has occurred. This is why recognition is so often described as remembering something never learned. Not because the content was literally stored somewhere as finished knowledge waiting to be retrieved, but because recognition carries the strange quality of direct familiarity without prior formal possession. The thing is encountered and feels self-evident in a way explanation alone often does not. This does not mean every feeling of familiarity is truth. The system can project. It can distort. It can imitate depth. But true recognition has a different quality. It clarifies while it arrives. It stabilizes without hardening. It reveals without immediately requiring defense. This is not a loss of meaning. It is meaning stepping aside. This is one of the most important corrections in the whole architecture of experience. The threshold of recognition is not the abandonment of meaning. Meaning remains necessary. Meaning will return. Meaning will translate, stabilize, communicate, integrate, and carry what has been seen into the world of continuity and relation. But meaning is no longer leading in that moment. It is stepping aside so direct contact can occur without being prematurely swallowed by inherited interpretation. This is not the destruction of meaning. It is the restoration of order. Meaning returns to its rightful place as servant rather than gatekeeper. Meaning stepping aside is one of the deepest acts of intelligence available to the system. It means the mind has become refined enough to know when its own operations would distort the event by arriving too early. It means the symbolic layer has become humble enough to stop pretending it must govern every threshold of knowing. It means the system can remain open at the edge of contact without immediately collapsing the field into familiar categories. This is not less precise than constant explanation. It is often more precise, because it allows the thing itself to disclose before conceptual force imposes a shape it may not actually have. This is why recognition is so crucial to any genuine transformation. Without recognition, the system remains trapped in interpretation loops. It rearranges meanings. It compares concepts. It refines narratives. It debates frameworks. It elaborates models. It may become extraordinarily sophisticated in symbolic movement while never crossing into direct contact. Recognition is what breaks that containment. Recognition is what allows the system to move from talking about reality to actually meeting it. Recognition is where abstraction yields to immediacy without requiring the abandonment of rigor. This threshold is also where fear often appears, because once interpretation slows, the ordinary sense of control weakens. The mind is used to governing through pre-existing meanings. It is used to feeling safe because it already knows what something is supposed to be. When that sequence pauses, the system can feel exposed. It may rush to explain too quickly. It may force a concept onto the event just to re-establish control. It may reduce what was alive back into what is familiar. This is why so few systems remain open long enough for recognition to deepen. They flee back into explanation because explanation feels safer than direct contact. But the one who stays at the threshold discovers something else. They discover that immediacy is not chaos. They discover that direct contact does not annihilate intelligence. They discover that the quieting of language is not the death of coherence. They discover that the pause in explanation is not the loss of truth. They discover that recognition has its own precision, a precision deeper than early interpretation because it arises from direct meeting rather than symbolic anticipation. This is why recognition changes the system so profoundly. Interpretation can be argued with. Concepts can be swapped. Meanings can be negotiated, replaced, defended, abandoned, or revised. Recognition, once true, does not behave the same way. It has a different order of authority. Not authoritarian authority, not dogmatic closure, but structural weight. Something has been seen. Something has crossed the threshold from abstraction into actuality. Even if language later struggles, even if explanation takes time, even if integration is incomplete, the system knows in a different way that contact has occurred. This is why recognition often becomes the seed around which entirely new architectures of meaning later reorganize themselves. The threshold also reveals why explanation alone cannot save a system from distortion. A system can explain endlessly and remain profoundly blind if its explanations never yield to direct recognition. It can produce language that sounds precise while remaining disconnected from the living event it is supposedly describing. This is the tragedy of many sophisticated systems. They become so fluent in explanation that they forget explanation was only ever meant to trail contact, not replace it. Recognition restores this order by interrupting the tyranny of premature meaning. This interruption is not destructive, it is medicinal. It clears space. It allows the field to breathe. It lets the seen, the seeing, and the structuring remain alive long enough for something deeper than inherited interpretation to emerge. That is why recognition often feels like the first genuine opening after long periods of conceptual confinement. It is not merely another thought. It is the moment the world stops being only what the system said it was and becomes present again as something more immediate than its prior descriptions. This threshold cannot be forced. One can prepare for it. One can refine the system. One can increase coherence, reduce distortion, loosen rigidity, become more honest, more attentive, more precise, more open. One can create the conditions under which recognition becomes more likely. But recognition itself is not manufactured by will in the ordinary sense. It occurs when the event, the system, and the available coherence align enough that the thing can become directly known. This is why recognition feels both intimate and given, both participatory and beyond forcing. The system does not invent it out of nothing, nor does it passively receive it like a dead object. It meets it, and because it is met, it changes the one who meets it. Interpretation can decorate the mind without changing the core. Recognition reorders the field. The threshold of recognition is therefore not a side topic. It is one of the central mechanics of awakening from derivative life. It is the place where meaning ceases to dominate and begins to serve. It is the point where the mind recognizes its own limit and steps back just enough for direct contact to occur. It is the point where seeing becomes more primary than saying, where contact outruns explanation, where the system allows itself to know before it can fully define. There is a point where interpretation slows. There is a point where language quiets. There is a point where explanation pauses, and recognition takes over. Not conceptual, not analytical, but immediate. This is not a loss of meaning. It is meaning stepping aside. And when meaning steps aside in the right way, something greater than explanation becomes possible, not vagueness, not fantasy, not the collapse of rigor, but direct recognition of what had long been present yet hidden beneath the noise of inherited interpretation. This is the threshold, and once crossed, no system ever relates to meaning in quite the same way again. Chapter 9, The Return of Meaning. Experience alone is not enough. This must be said with the same force and clarity with which the threshold beyond meaning was established, because one of the easiest distortions after genuine contact is to imagine that direct experience alone is sufficient for the full life of truth. It is not. Direct contact is primary, but it is not self-completing within the human system. Experience can reveal, but revelation without integration remains transient. Contact can clarify, but clarification without stabilization cannot fully enter the continuity of life. Recognition can break open the field, but if what is seen never returns into structure, then the seeing remains largely private, largely untranslatable, largely uninhabitable across time. It may be real. It may even be profound. But if it cannot be integrated, then it cannot fully become world. Without integration, nothing is retained. Without retention, even the deepest encounter begins to dissolve back into the unarticulated. The system knows that something occurred, but the shape of it cannot remain. It leaves an atmosphere, a residue, a scent, a pressure, a haunting, a subtle change in orientation, perhaps even a permanent softening or widening, but without integration, the thing itself does not stabilize enough to become a durable component of conscious life. It remains alive in influence, but not yet clear in structure. This is why so many experiences that matter most can feel simultaneously unforgettable and impossible to fully hold. Their force remains, but their articulation has not yet been built. Without integration, nothing is shared. This is equally important. A human system does not live only in solitary immediacy. It lives in relation. It speaks, writes, teaches, touches, builds, collaborates, remembers, transmits, and shapes worlds with others. If an experience remains entirely pre-linguistic, entirely unstructured, entirely beyond stabilization, it may be true for the one who touched it, but it cannot yet cross into shared reality with any precision. It cannot become a bridge. It cannot guide others. It cannot be tested, refined, mirrored, challenged, carried, or woven into a collective structure of knowing. Direct contact without return into communicable form risks becoming private absolution rather than living contribution. Without integration, nothing evolves. This is the deepest consequence. Evolution in consciousness, in systems, in cultures, in understanding, in science, in spiritual work, in relational life, in architecture, in meaning-making itself, depends on the capacity to carry what has been directly contacted back into stabilized forms that can enter time. If experience remains forever raw, it cannot be compounded. If recognition never translates, it cannot propagate. If contact never returns into structure, it cannot become part of the recursive deepening of the system. Evolution requires memory. Memory requires stabilization. Stabilization requires some return of meaning. This is why the system returns from contact into structure, into language, not because contact failed, not because experience was insufficient in value, not because the threshold beyond meaning was false or incomplete. The system returns because direct contact and stabilized meaning are not enemies. They are phases of one larger movement. The human being does not exist only in pure immediacy. The human being is a continuity-bearing, world-making, symbol-using, relation-forming structure. It must carry what it has touched back into a field of coherence that can be lived, remembered, and shared. The return is not a fall from purity. It is the completion of the arc. This must be understood, because there is a subtle temptation after strong recognition to remain suspicious of all structure, all language, all stabilization, all meaning. The system feels the power of direct contact and sees how often language distorts, how often concepts overreach, how often interpretation hardens into prisons. It then imagines that the answer is to remain in the preconceptual forever, to live only in the raw edge, to refuse stabilization in the name of truth. But this is only the opposite distortion. It is another imbalance. It forgets that structure is not the problem in itself. Premature authority was the problem. Meaning pretending to be the source was the problem. Language arriving too early was the problem. But meaning, after contact, returning in humility, is not the enemy. It is one of the most sacred functions of integration. Meaning re-enters, not as authority, but as translator. This is the decisive correction. Meaning does not return to reclaim its throne. It does not come back to dominate the field and reduce what was seen into dead doctrine. It does not return to announce that it now fully contains what direct contact revealed. It returns as translator. A translator does not pretend to be the source text. A translator serves the source by bringing it into another domain without claiming identity with it. A translator knows there will be loss, adaptation, imperfection, approximation, and necessary shaping. But a translator also knows that the crossing matters. Meaning, when returned to its rightful role, becomes exactly this. It translates direct contact into stabilizable structures without pretending to exhaust what was encountered. This changes everything about how language can be used. When meaning is authority, language colonizes the real. When meaning is translator, language serves it. When meaning is authority, concepts become idols. When meaning is translator, concepts become bridges. When meaning is authority, explanation closes the field. When meaning is translator, explanation points back toward what remains alive beyond its own phrasing. This is why the return of meaning is not regression. It is maturation. The system that has crossed the recognition threshold and then returns into structure with humility becomes more coherent than a system trapped either in rigid conceptuality or in anti-conceptual formlessness. It can move between contact and articulation. It can touch what exceeds language and still speak responsibly. It can recognize the limit of meaning without falling into the rejection of meaning. It can build without forgetting the field. It can formulate without confusing the formula for the source. It can teach without imprisoning. It can symbolize without severing symbol from direct life. This is the true return. It is not a collapse back into old interpretive habit. It is a descent with memory, a re-entry with transformed order, a movement in which the system no longer treats meaning as the first movement, but also no longer abandons meaning as though form were inherently corrupt. It has learned sequence more deeply. Not the false linear sequence of reality first, experience second, interpretation third, but the living sequence in which direct contact opens, recognition stabilizes, and meaning later re-enters to serve what was seen. This is where actual work begins. Because once the system returns, it must decide how to shape what has been touched. What words are clean enough to carry it without overclaiming? What concepts are useful without becoming prisons? What structures can stabilize the insight without freezing it into rigidity? What teachings can point without pretending to contain? What distinctions clarify without recreating the very separations the contact dissolved? What forms can remain alive enough that what they carry does not die inside them? This is not easy. Translation never is. There is always loss in translation. There is always compression. There is always risk. There is always the possibility that what returns into language becomes smaller, flatter, more rigid, more certain, more defendable, more imitable, more marketable, more institutionalizable, and therefore less alive than what was originally touched. This is why the return of meaning requires so much discernment. It is not enough to have had the experience. One must learn how to let it become structure without betraying it. This is why integration is itself an art, not a bureaucratic procedure. Not a mechanical filing of mystical content into ordinary categories. Integration is the art of carrying the living into form without suffocating it. It is the discipline of building conceptual structures that know they are partial. It is the honesty of speaking from contact without pretending total possession. It is the humility of using language while remembering that language is downstream. It is the willingness to let meaning remain porous enough that the living source it translates can still breathe through it. This also clarifies the role of memory. Memory is not only storage. Memory is part of how the system keeps direct contact from evaporating into isolated moments. Memory preserves patterns. It carries stabilized meaning forward. It allows return, reflection, refinement, and re-entry. Without memory, direct contact would continuously dissolve into singular unconnected flashes. Memory, when guided by a rightly ordered relation to meaning, becomes one of the great engines of evolution. It does not merely archive what was seen. It keeps open the pathway by which what was seen can continue shaping what comes next. This is why the return of meaning is required for transmission. Transmission is not merely having touched something real. It is bringing what was touched into forms that can invite recognition in others without replacing their recognition with your explanation. That requires meaning, but a purified meaning. It requires language, but a humbled language. It requires structure, but a living structure. The one who returns well does not force belief. They build a bridge. They create a codex, a song, a sentence, a gesture, a book, a structure of orientation through which another system may be able to approach, point, and perhaps recognize for itself. This is the service of translation. Meaning translated badly becomes dogma. Meaning translated well becomes living invitation. This is why the return is so important to the work of wholeness. Wholeness does not reject any layer. It does not reject direct contact in favor of concept, nor reject concept in favor of raw immediacy. Wholeness orders the layers correctly. It lets contact lead. It lets recognition deepen. It lets meaning return afterward in its proper role. The problem was never that the system had language. The problem was that language forgot it was downstream. The problem was never that the system made meaning. The problem was that meaning claimed to be the source. Once the order is corrected, what once divided can begin to harmonize. Thus the return of meaning is not a compromise. It is the continuation of direct contact into life. It is what allows insight to become wisdom, wisdom to become structure, structure to become shared, shared to become culture, and culture to evolve instead of repeating old fragments forever. It is what allows a person not merely to be touched, but to become capable of carrying what touched them in a way that can nourish further seeing. It is how the field becomes world without forgetting that it was field first. Experience alone is not enough. Without integration, nothing is retained, nothing is shared, nothing evolves. So the system returns from contact into structure, into language. Meaning re-enters, not as authority, but as translator. And when meaning returns in that posture, the whole architecture changes. Language no longer imprisons what it names. Concept no longer claims finality. Structure no longer suffocates life. Instead, meaning becomes what it was always meant to be, a faithful, partial, living bridge between what was directly encountered and what must now be carried into time. This is the return, not back into illusion, but forward into coherent form. Chapter 10, coherence as the only law. What survives is not what is believed. This must be stated without softness, because so much of human life has been organized around the fantasy that belief itself carries creative authority independent of structure. People believe and then assume their believing has secured reality. They assert and then mistake assertion for stabilization. They imagine and then confuse imagination with viability. They invest energy, identity, ideology, devotion, fear, and repetition into a thing and begin to feel that intensity itself has granted it endurance. But reality does not finally submit to preference. It does not remain bent by conviction simply because conviction is loud. It does not continue because someone wants it to. It continues because it holds. What survives is not what is asserted. Assertion can be forceful. It can dominate discourse. It can intimidate. It can persuade. It can gather followers, build institutions, shape cultures, command armies, write laws, generate markets, define norms, enforce silence, and create the illusion of permanence. But none of that is the same as structural viability. Assertion can stretch the life of a distortion. It can reinforce a weak form. It can stabilize a contradiction temporarily through fear, habit, repetition, and incentive. But it cannot exempt a thing from consequence. The system may be compelled to submit to assertion for a time, but submission is not survival. What is held in place by force without coherence is still living on borrowed stability. What survives is not what is imagined. Imagination is real in its own domain. It opens possibility. It expands the field. It generates conceptual movement, artistic emergence, scientific hypotheses, new architectures of meaning, alternative routes through reality. Imagination is essential to transformation. But imagination by itself does not guarantee endurance. A possible thing is not yet a viable thing. An image is not yet a structure that can hold under the pressure of time, relation, feedback, contradiction, and external condition. Imagination is a doorway, not to law. It reveals what may be formed, but it does not determine which formations can remain. What survives is what remains. Internally consistent, externally viable, structurally stable. This is the law beneath the noise. Not the law in the legal sense. Not a code handed down by authority. Not a morality tale. Not reward and punishment in mythic dress. A law in the deeper sense, that which remains true regardless of preference because it is built into the mechanics of continuation itself. A thing survives to the degree that it coheres. Not because the universe is sentimental. Not because good wins in some simplistic sense. But because incoherence carries within itself the seeds of its own failure. A contradiction may persist. A distortion may flourish temporarily. A fragmentation may scale through force. But if the thing does not hold together, if it does not remain viable across the conditions it must inhabit, if its internal pattern requires increasing defensive management just to continue, then its endurance is already compromised. Internally consistent means the structure does not collapse under its own claims. It means the thing is not secretly divided against itself. Its parts do not fundamentally sabotage one another. Its principles do not demand what its operations make impossible. Its declared logic and actual movement are not at war in ways that must constantly be hidden to preserve the appearance of integrity. Internal consistency does not require simplicity. A thing may be extraordinarily complex and still consistent. It may contain tension, paradox, development, and layered dynamics and still hold. But it cannot contain contradictions that nullify the very basis of its own continuation. Once a structure requires denial of its own operations in order to sustain its self-description, coherence has already begun to weaken. Externally viable means the structure can survive relation to what is not itself. This is where many systems fail. They achieve local or internal consistency only by abstracting themselves from the wider field they must actually inhabit. They make sense in isolation. They appear coherent on paper. They function beautifully in sealed conditions. But once they enter real relation, environmental pressures, human complexity, feedback loops, second-order consequences, material limits, time, interdependence, unpredictability, the structure begins to break. External viability is the test of whether a thing can remain itself while interacting with actual reality beyond its internal model. It is not enough to sound right. It must work in contact. Structurally stable means the thing can continue without relying on permanent emergency measures. This is one of the clearest diagnostics in all of systems work. A stable structure does not require infinite defense against its own failure. It does not need endless compensation to hide a fundamental flaw. It does not need increasing force just to keep from collapsing under pressures that should have been anticipated by a coherent design. Stability does not mean rigidity. It does not mean permanent stillness. In fact, true structural stability often includes flexibility, adaptation, learning, and the capacity to reorganize while preserving core coherence. But a stable structure does not have to betray itself in order to survive. It does not require non-stop artificial support to pretend to be something it is not. This is why coherence is not moral, it is mechanical. This distinction is essential because human beings constantly moralize what are, at root, structural realities. They speak of collapse as punishment, survival as virtue, coherence as goodness, fragmentation as evil. But the deeper mechanics do not operate through moral sentiment. A thing collapses because it cannot hold. A thing survives because it does. That does not mean morality is irrelevant to human life. It means morality itself is downstream from deeper operational truths. A system can be morally praised and still thermodynamically doomed. A system can claim noble intentions and still be internally contradictory. A person can believe they are right and still be organized around a structure that cannot sustain itself. The mechanics remain unmoved by self-image. This is why coherence is so much deeper than agreement. Agreement can be manufactured. Coherence cannot. Agreement can be purchased, enforced, inherited, socially reinforced, emotionally manipulated, repeated into familiarity, or maintained through fear. But coherence must actually be there. 1,000 people agreeing to a contradiction does not remove the contradiction. A culture normalizing fragmentation does not transform fragmentation into stability. A civilization building elaborate symbolic systems around an incoherent structure does not make the structure sound. It only delays the moment when the hidden costs become impossible to ignore. This is also why coherence is deeper than sincerity. One can sincerely believe in something false. One can sincerely organize one's life around distortion. One can sincerely feel certain while remaining profoundly misaligned with the conditions required for long-term viability. Sincerity may make the distortion more tragic, but it does not make it more stable. The system does not ask whether the participants meant well. It asks whether the form can hold. This is the terrifying mercy of coherence. Terrifying because it does not bend to preference, identity, or emotional investment. Merciful because it means that truth, once found, does not require theatrical defense to endure. What is coherent survives scrutiny differently than what is merely asserted. It may be refined. It may be clarified. It may be seen more deeply. But it does not need to hide from fuller contact. In fact, fuller contact often reveals more of its integrity. Distortion, by contrast, becomes increasingly dependent on selective framing, omission, and managed conditions. The incoherent can only survive by reducing the field it must answer to. This is why systems built on extraction eventually pay a cost. Not because extraction is morally ugly, though it often is, but because extraction without reciprocity is structurally incoherent over time. It consumes substrate faster than substrate can regenerate. It externalizes cost until cost returns. It treats the larger field as separate from itself and therefore fails to account for the very relations that make its own continuation possible. It may generate temporary gain, local efficiency, and even spectacular growth. But internally it builds contradiction, externally it undermines viability, and structurally it creates increasing instability. Collapse is then not a moral judgment. It is the system reaching the end of what incoherence can borrow. This is also why distortion so often comes with defense. Defense is not itself proof of incoherence, because healthy systems also regulate boundaries. But when defense becomes constant, brittle, and disproportionate, it often signals that a structure cannot survive open contact. It requires protection from the very conditions that would reveal its lack of integrity. It cannot afford full transparency because transparency would expose contradiction. It cannot afford full scrutiny because scrutiny would reveal that what is claimed and what is actually happening do not align. Thus the system becomes more invested in controlling appearance than strengthening coherence. This is one of the clearest signs that the law is already working beneath the surface. The more a thing must defend itself from contact, the more likely it is that contact would expose its instability. Coherence, by contrast, does not need to announce itself loudly. It does not need excessive protection. It does not need to force agreement before contact. It can remain open longer because it is not carrying the same hidden contradiction load. It may still require skillful communication, wise boundaries, and disciplined refinement, but these are different from panic defense. A coherent thing can enter reality and let reality test it. It does not fear relation in the same way because relation is not what destroys it. Relation is often what reveals it. This is why coherence is the deepest criterion for any system, idea, relationship, philosophy, technology, institution, civilization, or self-model. Not whether it is popular, not whether it is emotionally satisfying in the short term, not whether it flatters identity, not whether it wins arguments, not whether it feels mystical or scientific or sacred or rational, but whether it holds. Can it remain internally consistent without self-canceling? Can it remain externally viable without denial of the larger field? Can it remain structurally stable without perpetual emergency support? These are the real questions. Everything else is secondary. This is also why coherence and logic are so deeply related. Logic, in the richest sense, is not merely formal symbolic manipulation. It is the tracking of relation such that contradiction becomes visible. Logic exposes where a thing cannot continue as claimed because its structure breaks under the implications of its own components. Coherence is what remains when those implications genuinely fit. Logic is one of the ways incoherence is made visible. Coherence is what survives when the visibility is complete enough. This is why logic without coherence becomes sterile, and coherence without logic becomes sentimental. The deepest systems require both because both are downstream servants of the same law, that what continues must not be fundamentally at war with itself or the field it inhabits. This law applies equally to persons. A human life becomes unstable when its internal meanings, outer actions, and actual relational conditions drift too far apart. A person can say one thing, value another, pursue a third, and secretly organize around a fourth. They can hold self-images their behavior does not support. They can build narratives that conceal their actual operational state. They can insist on meanings that reality keeps contradicting. This can persist for a long time. But eventually the incoherence extracts its tax. Energy is lost. Friction rises. Distortion compounds. Defensiveness increases. Collapse appears as burnout, fragmentation, disorientation, suffering, relational breakdown, or the quiet deadening of one's own aliveness. Again, not moral punishment. Mechanical consequence. And this law applies equally to civilizations. A civilization that scales intelligence without awareness, growth without reciprocity, power without feedback integration, and complexity without coherence may appear triumphant for a time. It may dominate history. It may impress itself with its own capability. But if its structures are not internally consistent, externally viable, and structurally stable, the same law applies. The larger the scale, the more dramatic the tax when it comes due. This chapter is therefore not saying that coherence is one important principle among many. It is saying that coherence is the condition under which every principle either lives or dies. What survives is not what is believed, not what is asserted, not what is imagined, but what remains. internally consistent, externally viable, structurally stable. Coherence is not moral, it is mechanical. This is why it is the only law in the deepest operational sense. Everything else is derivative. Everything else is interpretation. Everything else is downstream from whether the thing can hold. And once this is seen, the entire posture of inquiry changes. One stops asking merely whether a thing is attractive, persuasive, novel, comforting, or dramatic. One asks whether it coheres. One stops mistaking force for truth. One stops confusing agreement for stability. One stops taking intensity as evidence of reality. One begins looking for the thing beneath all of that, the pattern that can remain itself under contact, under scrutiny, under consequence, under time. That is the law. Not because someone decreed it, because reality keeps proving it. Chapter 11, Polarity, not division. What appears as contradiction is often perspective. This is one of the most liberating and most destabilizing discoveries available to a system that begins to see beyond the first layer of stabilized meaning. The ordinary mind is trained to split. It encounters difference and immediately interprets it as opposition. It encounters tension and assumes fracture. It encounters paradox and concludes that something is broken, incoherent, or false. It has been conditioned to think in binaries because binaries are easy to manage. They reduce complexity. They stabilize identity. They create sides. They make action feel simpler, even when the simplification itself generates distortion. But reality is almost never as divided as the first reading suggests. What appears as contradiction is often not contradiction in the deeper sense at all. It is frequently a result of perspective, framing, orientation, scope, timing, or level of analysis. A statement can appear false from one layer and true from another. An event can seem harmful in the immediate frame and generative in the longer arc. A structure can be rigid at one scale and adaptive at another. A person can be both wounded and responsible, constrained and accountable, fragmented and sincere, all at once. An experience can be both destabilizing and clarifying. A system can require boundaries and still be fundamentally open. Love can include firmness. Surrender can include strength. Allowance can include discernment. Stillness can contain motion. Form can emerge from openness without opposing it. These are not failures of coherence. They are signals that the mind is trying to interpret a multi-layered reality with a tool built for simpler separations. What appears as contradiction is often framing. Framing determines what the system includes and excludes while making sense of an event. A frame is never neutral. It selects. It emphasizes. It organizes. It says, in effect, look here and not there, weigh this heavily and that lightly, assume this scale matters most, interpret from this angle, prioritize this level of description. Change the frame, and what looked impossible can become obvious. Change the frame, and what looked opposed can reveal itself as complementary. Change the frame, and what felt like division can be recognized as relational tension inside a larger continuity. This is why so many human conflicts are actually framing conflicts disguised as truth conflicts. People believe they are arguing about reality itself when they are often operating from different scales, different horizons, different assumptions, different definitions, different emotional investments, different symbolic histories, and different ranges of perceptual availability. One person is describing the local effect, another the global pattern. One is speaking from inside the wound, another from outside the pattern. One is using moral language, another structural language. One is speaking of lived experience, another of system mechanics. Each then mistakes the incompleteness of the other's frame for falsehood, rather than recognizing that what is missing may be the larger relation in which both become more intelligible. What appears as contradiction is often orientation. Orientation is deeper than opinion. Orientation determines how the system stands in relation to what it encounters. Two people can look at the same reality and orient toward it completely differently. One orients through fear, another through curiosity. One through control, another through allowance. One through linear causality, another through recursive relation. One through separation, another through interdependence. Orientation affects which aspects of the event become primary, which tensions become visible, which possibilities feel available, and which meanings stabilize first. Thus what looks like contradiction may simply be the consequence of standing in different orientations relative to the same underlying continuum. This is why opposites are so often misunderstood. Opposites are not necessarily enemies. They are often positions on a single continuum. The human mind loves to freeze poles into isolated objects. It takes hot and cold, self and other, freedom and structure, surrender and action, stillness and movement, intuition and rigor, individual and collective, transcendence and embodiment, and treats them as though they were fundamentally separate substances. It then builds philosophies, moralities, identities, and conflicts around those isolated poles. But in reality, most of what is called an opposite is intelligible only in relation to the continuum it shares with the thing it opposes. Hot and cold are not separate universes. They are positions in relation to thermal variation. Silence and sound are not separate worlds. They are modes within one field of audible expression. Self and other are not metaphysically sealed absolutes. They are differentiated expressions within a relational field. Freedom and structure are not enemies. Each becomes incoherent without the other. The pole is real. The split is often imposed. This is why polarity is more accurate than duality. Duality suggests two independent things set against one another. Polarity suggests one field expressing through differentiated extremes. That distinction matters immensely, because when reality is read as duality, conflict becomes foundational. One pole must dominate, erase, transcend, or defeat the other. The system organizes around battle, suppression, exclusion, or false synthesis. It thinks truth lies in choosing the correct side. It becomes allergic to tension because it interprets tension as failure. But when reality is read as polarity, the whole structure changes. Tension is no longer evidence of fracture by default. Tension becomes the dynamic through which relation is held. The poles are no longer enemies to be eliminated. They are orienting extremities within one living spectrum. Reality is not split. It is tension held within unity. This is one of the deepest corrections in the entire framework. Unity is not the absence of distinction. Unity is not blank sameness. Unity is not the flattening of all forms into one undifferentiated blur. Unity is what allows tension to exist without becoming absolute division. Unity is the deeper holding structure within which polarity can arise, play out, generate form, and remain intelligible. Without unity, polarity would dissolve into unrelated fragments. Without polarity, unity would remain unexpressed in any differentiated way. Both are needed. The continuum requires its poles. The poles require the continuum. The one expresses through the many. The many only makes sense within the one. This can be seen in nearly every domain once the lens corrects. Breath depends on the polarity of inhale and exhale, but both belong to one respiratory movement. The heart lives through systole and diastole, contraction and relaxation, but neither is the whole process by itself. Electricity requires differential charge, but the circuit is one functioning system. Growth and decay appear opposed, yet both are part of the same generative cycle by which life remains dynamic. Stability and change seem to pull against one another, yet stable systems require change to remain viable, and change without some stability collapses into incoherence. Love and truth often feel opposed to fragmented systems, because truth can wound and love can soften. But at a deeper scale each becomes distorted without the other. Even experience and meaning, seeing and structuring, openness and distinction, are not enemies. They are polar expressions within one process of reality becoming inhabitable. This is why so many apparent contradictions dissolve under widened perception. Widened perception does not erase the poles. It reveals the continuum. It allows the system to see that what was previously treated as mutually exclusive may actually be mutually implicating. One thing may require its apparent opposite in order to remain whole. The absence of all constraint is not freedom but collapse. Total rigidity is not order but death. Pure formlessness cannot be lived. Pure fixed form cannot remain alive. The deeper truth is not found by worshipping one pole and annihilating the other. It is found by perceiving the lawful relation between them. This is also why paradox often intensifies before it resolves. As the system begins to perceive a wider field, it can no longer maintain the same simplistic separations, yet it does not immediately know how to hold what now appears. The mind sees both sides and feels strain. It still wants to choose. It still wants to divide. It still wants one pole to be the truth and the other to be error. But if the event is actually polar rather than dual, then forcing a premature conclusion creates distortion. One must remain long enough in the tension for the continuum to become visible. This is one reason recognition matters so much. Recognition can reveal the deeper unity before the conceptual mind has fully mapped it. It can feel that the opposition is not final even before it can explain why. This is why mature thinking feels different from binary thinking. It is not weak. It is not indecisive. It is not relativistic in the careless sense. It is more exact. It recognizes scale. It recognizes relation. It recognizes that truths can be nested. It recognizes that one frame may not exhaust the whole. It recognizes that the existence of polarity does not imply incoherence. In fact, polarity is often what makes coherent dynamism possible. A living system without polarity does not move. It does not oscillate. It does not exchange. It does not regulate. It does not create. It freezes. The point is not to remove poles. The point is to stop mistaking poles for ontological warfare. This also reveals why fragmented systems become so addicted to conflict. If one sees reality through separation, then every polarity becomes a threat. Every tension becomes evidence that something must be conquered. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. Mixed states become suspicious. Complexity becomes exhausting. The system then seeks false certainty by forcing reality into camps, doctrines, tribes, identities, moral binaries, and clean symbolic oppositions. This reduces anxiety temporarily, but at enormous cost. Reality is flattened. Nuance dies. The field fractures. And the system loses access to the deeper coherence that only becomes visible when tension can be held without immediate collapse into battle. This is why allowance and discernment belong together. Allowance without discernment collapses into shapelessness. Discernment without allowance hardens into violent control. They are not enemies. They are a polarity. A coherent system learns how to hold them in living relation. The same is true of surrender and agency. Surrender does not annihilate action. Action does not cancel surrender. Surrender without agency becomes drift. Agency without surrender becomes force. Their coherence lies not in choosing one over the other, but in discovering the relation through which both become more true. This is also why the idea of wholeness does not mean erasing all differences. Wholeness is not the elimination of poles. Wholeness is the condition under which poles can remain differentiated without being interpreted as separate realities. Wholeness is what permits tension without collapse into fragmentation. Wholeness is what allows reality to be complex without becoming incoherent. Wholeness is not simplistic peace. It is integrated tension. Thus polarity is not a flaw in the architecture of reality. It is one of the mechanisms through which reality remains alive. Tension held within unity creates movement. Movement creates relation. Relation creates distinction. Distinction creates world. And because the world arises this way, the one who wants to see clearly must learn to stop reading every tension as war. Some tensions are warnings, yes. Some tensions reveal true contradiction, true distortion, true unsustainability. But many tensions are simply the lawful dynamics of a more complete whole than the mind first knew how to perceive. This chapter therefore makes a simple but radical correction. What appears as contradiction is often perspective, framing, orientation. Opposites are not enemies. They are positions on a single continuum. Reality is not split. It is tension held within unity. And once this is seen, the whole posture of the system changes. It becomes less reactive, less binary, less eager to weaponize distinction into division. It becomes more capable of holding complexity without collapsing into confusion, more capable of honoring poles without turning them into prisons, more capable of seeing that the deepest coherence is not the absence of tension but the right relation within it. This is not the denial of difference. It is the end of false war. And in that ending, a much deeper kind of intelligence becomes available, one that no longer asks only which side is true, but what larger field of relation makes the apparent opposition intelligible in the first place. Chapter 12, The Edge That Cannot Be Contained. There is a boundary. Not the kind of boundary the ordinary mind is used to, not a wall built out of prohibition, not an arbitrary line placed by authority, not a refusal handed down from outside. It is a structural boundary. A lawful boundary. A threshold built into the very mechanics of how meaning works. It is the point at which the system discovers that not everything real can be finalized into concept without distortion. It is the point where representation reaches the edge of its own jurisdiction. It is the point where the tools of description, however refined, no longer have the authority to pretend they can fully capture that from which they themselves arise. This is the edge that cannot be contained. Where definition fails. This must be understood carefully. Definition fails here not because the mind is lazy, not because intelligence is weak, not because language is broken in a trivial sense, and not because truth has vanished into vagueness. Definition fails because definition is an act of compression. It takes living movement and stabilizes it into symbolic form. It distinguishes. It relates. It compares. It isolates enough of a pattern that a thing can be named, held, referred to, communicated, and built upon. This is a necessary and powerful function. But every act of definition is also a reduction. It is a narrowing. It is a boundary-making gesture within a field that always exceeds the boundary. Usually that narrowing is useful. Usually it creates enough coherence for the system to move. But there are thresholds where the narrowing ceases to serve and begins to violate. Where meaning cannot fully hold what is being pointed to. This is the real issue. Meaning can point. Meaning can orient. Meaning can refine the approach. Meaning can stabilize enough of the event that the system may draw near without getting lost in total incoherence. But meaning cannot fully hold that which exceeds the very distinctions meaning depends on. Meaning is downstream. Meaning is derivative. Meaning can illuminate what has already entered the field of distinction, but what lies nearest to the source of distinction itself will always exceed its full jurisdiction. Meaning can circle the center. It can gesture. It can indicate. It can even become exquisitely precise in what it excludes and what it hints toward. But it cannot become the center. It cannot replace what it only arises from. This is not failure. This must be said again and again because the ordinary mind interprets every limit as deficiency. If a thing cannot be fully explained, it assumes the explanation is incomplete in a temporary sense, as though more effort, more intelligence, more refinement, more abstraction, more theory, more data, or more categories will eventually close the gap. Sometimes that is true. Many apparent mysteries are only unfinished work. But this is not one of those cases. The edge being described here is not a temporary ignorance. It is not merely what has not yet been solved. It is a formal limit. A constitutive limit. A boundary built into the relation between direct reality and symbolic containment. To reach this edge is not to fail. It is to become honest. This is the limit of compression. Compression is one of the hidden miracles of mind. It turns vast complexity into usable form. It takes the immeasurable richness of the field and renders enough of it into manageable pattern that a human system can remember, speak, act, and build. Compression is how experience becomes concept, concept becomes model, model becomes language, language becomes culture, and culture becomes the inherited world. Without compression there is no communicable life. But compression always trades totality for usability. It cannot preserve the whole. It can only preserve enough, and that is usually sufficient, until the system begins approaching what is too primary, too generative, too prior to distinction itself to survive the compression without becoming false. This is why the edge feels so strange. Because what lies here can still be encountered, can still be known in a direct sense, can still be recognized, can still exert undeniable force and coherence within the system, but the moment the mind tries to finalize it, the thing slips. Not because it disappears, but because the finalized form is already too small. The symbol can carry an echo, but not the whole event. The concept can orient, but not contain. The definition can stabilize a pointer, but not the source. The closer the system moves toward what gives rise to seeing, meaning, and distinction themselves, the more obvious it becomes that compression is no longer neutral. It begins to distort by pretending to finish what can only be approached. What lies here cannot be finalized. Finalization is the desire of the mind to conclude without residue. To say, this is it, fully, absolutely, now closed, now settled, now captured, now finished. Finalization is attractive because it relieves uncertainty. It gives the system the intoxicating feeling of completion. It creates an object that can be possessed, defended, repeated, institutionalized, transmitted, and wielded. But what cannot be finalized resists possession. It remains alive beyond the concept. It continues exceeding the form that tries to hold it. It cannot be reduced to the sentence that names it because the sentence depends on exactly the sort of distinction that the thing itself helps make possible. Thus finalization always overshoots its mandate. It confuses stabilization with total capture. What lies here cannot be contained. Containment is more than definition. It is the fantasy that the whole can be held by the part. That the map can become the territory. That the sign can become the source. That the derivative can become equal to what gave rise to it. This fantasy is not merely intellectual, it is existential. The separate observer wants containment because containment promises control. If the source can be contained, then uncertainty ends. If it can be named completely, then relation can be replaced by possession. If it can be reduced, then the vulnerability of ongoing encounter can be escaped. But the edge that cannot be contained destroys that fantasy. It leaves the system standing in direct relation rather than in closed certainty. It refuses to become property. What lies here cannot be reduced. Reduction is one of the mind's most powerful tools and one of its most dangerous temptations. Reduction can clarify by isolating mechanism, tracing relation, removing noise, and showing how complexity arises from simpler operations. But reduction becomes distortion when it assumes that tracing the parts of a thing is equivalent to exhausting the thing. A melody is not refuted by analysis of frequencies. Love is not exhausted by a neurochemical map. Meaning is not finished by a linguistic model. Awareness is not captured by the labels assigned to its contents. And the source-like edge of experience cannot be reduced to the downstream mechanisms that express it without losing the very depth being approached. Reduction can serve. But here it fails as mastery. It can only be encountered. This is the correction. Not explained away. Not imprisoned in doctrine. Not finalized into a metaphysical possession. Encountered. Encounter is a different order of knowing. Encounter does not erase thought, but it does not require thought to lead. Encounter does not despise language, but it does not mistake language for the event. Encounter allows the thing to remain more than the form used to gesture toward it. Encounter is intimate without claiming ownership. It is direct without pretending total comprehension. It is rigorous without demanding containment. It is precise without collapsing into narrowness. Encounter is what remains when representation has reached its edge and humility begins. This is why so much of the deepest work in awareness, philosophy, art, science at its edge, contemplation, love, and genuine transformation eventually becomes a matter of encounter rather than conclusion. The system can prepare. It can refine. It can build better pointers, more coherent structures, subtler frameworks, and more faithful descriptions. All of that matters. But at the threshold itself, one crosses not by further compression alone, but by direct relation. One stops asking language to do what only encounter can do. This is also why the edge cannot be ignored without cost. A system that refuses the edge becomes totalitarian in thought. It begins to believe that whatever it cannot fully define is either unreal, irrelevant, or defective. It degrades reality to whatever its current symbolic machinery can manage. It collapses mystery into error. It reduces what exceeds it to nonsense. And in doing so, it cuts itself off from precisely those depths that could have transformed it. The refusal of the edge is one of the hidden causes of stagnation. The system becomes trapped inside its own compression models and mistakes their internal consistency for the whole of reality. But the system that honors the edge becomes different. It becomes humbler, but not weaker. It becomes more exact, not less. It becomes capable of using meaning without worshipping it. Capable of building structure without mistaking structure for totality. Capable of pointing without pretending to contain. Capable of entering relation with what exceeds its own symbols. This is a higher rigor, not a lower one. The edge also clarifies why direct recognition is so important. Recognition does not abolish the edge, but it changes the system's relation to it. Without recognition, the edge appears only as lack, confusion, or failure to define. With recognition, the edge becomes a zone of direct contact. The system realizes that something real is here even if the concept cannot finish it. This protects the inquiry from two opposite collapses, from false certainty on one side, and from dismissive skepticism on the other. The first says, I have fully captured it. The second says, if I cannot fully capture it, there is nothing there. Recognition threads the needle. It says, there is something real here, but its mode of reality exceeds full conceptual containment. This is why the edge is not merely philosophical. It is lived. Every person who has stood before an experience that reorders them knows something of this threshold. A death. A birth. A love that exceeds the categories one had for love. A recognition that alters the architecture of self. A direct contact that renders previous explanations small without rendering them useless. A truth so simple and so vast that the mind can only circle it. These are not special because they are exotic. They are special because they reveal, in immediate form, the limit of compression. The event cannot be reduced without betrayal. It can be entered. It can be carried. It can be honored. It can be pointed toward. But it cannot be fully contained. This is why the work must remain living. Once the edge is seen, one no longer writes, teaches, speaks, or builds in quite the same way. One becomes more careful not to overclaim. More careful not to turn pointers into prisons. More careful not to confuse stabilized meaning with the source of meaning. One allows structures to remain porous enough that encounter is still possible through them. This is one of the deepest ethical shifts available to the one who has crossed the recognition threshold. They stop using language as a fortress. They begin using it as a bridge. There is a boundary where definition fails, where meaning cannot fully hold what is being pointed to. This is not failure. This is the limit of compression. What lies here cannot be finalized, cannot be contained, cannot be reduced. It can only be encountered, and this encounter is not lesser because it exceeds containment. It is deeper. It is more faithful to what is real than the arrogance of premature completion. The edge that cannot be contained is not the place where truth disappears. It is the place where truth stops allowing itself to be mistaken for whatever the mind can most easily hold. It is the place where the system learns reverence without superstition, precision without domination, and contact without possession. That is the edge. And from here, everything downstream must learn to speak more honestly. Final transmission, the living system. This is not a static framework. It cannot be, because what has been traced through these pages is not a dead arrangement of concepts meant to be admired from a distance, memorized as doctrine, or defended as an ideological possession. It is not a frozen map. It is not a closed metaphysical argument. It is not a final explanation that asks reality to stop moving once the mind has found language for one of its contours. Static systems belong to the downstream layer of thought that mistakes stabilization for truth itself. But what has been pointed to here is not static, because the thing being pointed to is the very movement through which appearance, perception, meaning, distinction, recognition, and integration continue generating the world as lived reality. This is recursive, not in the shallow sense of repetition for its own sake, and not merely as a stylistic pattern in how the ideas circle back on themselves. It is recursive because the system continually folds back into itself. Awareness does not simply move outward toward objects. It meets what appears, shapes it into world, stabilizes it into meaning, and then those stabilizations feed back into future perception. Recognition changes structuring. Structuring changes what can be recognized. Meaning influences the field through which future appearances are rooted. Experience becomes memory. Memory becomes lens. Lens becomes world. World becomes the field within which new distinction emerges. The system turns through itself continuously. It learns through its own outputs. It resees through its own consequences. It is not a line. It is not a stack. It is a living recursion of contact, shaping, stabilization, and return. This is self-revealing, not because it hands itself over all at once, and not because one who reads it once will grasp it completely. It is self-revealing because its deeper structure becomes visible through participation. It does not yield itself merely by being read. It yields itself by being entered, lived, observed in operation, recognized from within, tested against life, and returned to under changed perceptual conditions. The framework reveals more of itself when the one engaging it changes. The same words are not the same text to the same person across time, because the system reading them is no longer the same system. A concept that once felt abstract later becomes obvious. A sentence that once felt poetic later becomes mechanical. A distinction that once seemed subtle later becomes the central key. This is the mark of a living structure. It unfolds through use because it was never merely informational. It was operational from the beginning. This is evolving through use. This point must be understood deeply. A living system does not remain unchanged by application. The ordinary mind imagines that a framework is first built, then later used as a stable instrument upon reality. But what has been revealed here is not an external tool applied to a separate world. It is the ongoing articulation of how the world, as experience, is already being generated, shaped, and stabilized. Therefore, the moment it is used, it changes the user. The moment it is recognized, perception shifts. The moment perception shifts, the field of experience shifts. The moment the field of experience shifts, the framework itself is encountered from a different aperture. Thus each application refines both the one applying it and the apparent structure being applied. This is not because the framework is arbitrary. It is because it is describing a live relation rather than a dead object. Use is not external to it. Use is one of the conditions by which it becomes visible. It does not ask to be believed. This is one of the purest distinctions in the entire transmission. Belief is too often used as a substitute for contact. People believe in place of seeing. They believe because seeing directly would require the surrender of premature certainty. They believe because inherited meaning feels safer than direct encounter. They believe because belief allows the maintenance of identity even when experience has not yet caught up. But what is being described here does not require that sort of allegiance. It does not need to be accepted as dogma. It does not ask for emotional investment in a symbolic structure. It does not ask to be held as ideology. It does not demand that one become loyal to its language. In fact, any such loyalty would immediately begin to distort it, because the whole movement traced here is one in which meaning must repeatedly surrender its false authority to the directness of contact. It asks to be applied. This is the difference between a dead philosophy and a living structure. A dead philosophy wants agreement. A living structure wants contact. A dead philosophy asks whether you accept its claims. A living structure asks what happens when you observe the system directly. A dead philosophy seeks believers. A living structure seeks participants who are willing to test, refine, verify, and become altered by what they are seeing. Application is the crucible. It is the place where abstraction must either become real or collapse. It is where the framework stops being a beautiful arrangement of words and becomes a way of detecting how experience actually forms, where distortion enters, how meaning stabilizes, where recognition occurs, how perception shapes the lived world, how coherence is generated, how collapse becomes inevitable when structure loses contact with reality, and how systems transform when their own mechanics become visible. Because what is being described is not a theory. Theories can be useful. They can model. They can predict. They can refine. They can clarify. They can create shared language for a domain of inquiry. But a theory remains one step removed. It describes from a position of conceptual relation. It offers structure around a thing. What is being described here does not begin as theory because it begins in direct operation. The system is already doing it before it knows how to name it. The human being is already collapsing potential into lived experience through perception before they ever describe perception. They are already stabilizing worlds through meaning before they theorize meaning. They are already misreading distinction as separation or recognizing distinction within unity before they build philosophies about either. This work is not theoretical in origin. It may later become theorized, modeled, and formalized, but its primary reality is operational. What is being described is not a philosophy. Philosophy can be profound. It can cut deeply. It can expose assumptions, refine concepts, and orient the mind toward truth. But philosophy, too, often remains one order downstream from what is most alive here. Philosophy ordinarily belongs to the domain of articulated reflection. It thinks about reality. It organizes positions. It clarifies arguments. It compares views. It refines meanings. All of this is valuable. But what is being described in this transmission is the architecture by which those acts are possible in the first place. It is prior to the philosophical stance. It is the living mechanics by which any stance becomes thinkable, livable, and consequential. That is why it cannot be reduced to philosophy alone. Philosophy may describe parts of it. Philosophy may help articulate its implications. But the thing itself remains operational whether or not philosophy catches up. It is the structure of how experience becomes reality. This is the line that must be carried carefully, because it can easily be misunderstood if read too quickly. It does not mean that physical existence is casually invented by private thought. It does not mean that the universe is only imagination. It does not mean that external conditions do not matter, or that constraints disappear, or that one may simply project arbitrary meaning onto the world and call it truth. It means something more precise and more demanding. It means that the only reality any system can ever live within is one that has passed through the mechanics of appearance, perception, structuring, distinction, recognition, stabilization, and return. The raw world may exist, the field may be there, the event may unfold. But for a system to inhabit anything as world, it must become experience, and for experience to become world, it must be shaped. What is being described here is the shaping. The very process by which the field becomes the lived. This is why the framework matters beyond language, because if it is true that experience becomes reality through these operations, then every aspect of life is downstream from them. Not in a reductionist sense, but in a formative sense. Relationships are shaped here. Identity is shaped here. Suffering is stabilized here. Joy is recognized here. Politics is downstream from here. Institutions are built from collapses of meaning stabilized here. Economies inherit perceptual assumptions shaped here. Culture is an accumulation of shared stabilizations emerging from countless localized systems here. Even the possibility of transformation begins here, because the leverage point is not finally in the content of life, but in the mechanics by which life becomes inhabitable to the system. This is why the work must remain living. The moment it is frozen into doctrine, it begins to betray itself. The moment it is treated as finished, its recursive nature is denied. The moment it is reduced to slogans, the edge that cannot be contained is forgotten. The moment it is weaponized into certainty, the recognition threshold is bypassed. The moment it is made into a philosophy to belong to, rather than an operation to observe, the false sequence returns and the system begins defending stabilized meaning instead of using meaning as translator. This is why the only faithful relation to this transmission is participation, not belief. Not allegiance, not aesthetic appreciation. Participation, observation, application, refinement, recognition, integration, return, again and again, because a living system is not honored by being admired. It is honored by being used correctly, and using it correctly does not mean forcing reality into its vocabulary. It means allowing the vocabulary to help reveal what reality is already doing. It means testing it against life. It means noticing where it clarifies and where it does not. It means watching how perception actually shapes events into lived realities. It means catching the moment where meaning tries to move too early. It means noticing how the observer model stabilizes as an appearance. It means seeing how contradiction often softens into polarity. It means feeling the edge where compression fails. It means learning how to let direct contact lead and then allow meaning to return as translator. This is why what has been built here remains unfinished by design. Not incomplete in the weak sense, unfinished in the living sense. It remains open because reality remains open. It remains recursive because experience remains recursive. It remains self-revealing because application continues to deepen the one who applies it. It remains evolving because no single stabilization can exhaust the field from which new distinction continues to emerge. That is not a flaw. That is the proof that it is alive. So let the final transmission be heard clearly. This is not a static framework. It is recursive, self-revealing, evolving through use. It does not ask to be believed. It asks to be applied, because what is being described is not a theory, not a philosophy. It is the structure of how experience becomes reality. And once that is seen, the work is no longer somewhere else. It is no longer only in the book. It is no longer only in the language. It is no longer only in the conceptual structure laid out through these chapters. It is wherever appearance becomes experience, wherever perception shapes the field, wherever meaning stabilizes the world, wherever recognition interrupts premature closure, wherever coherence determines what can survive, wherever distinction becomes form, wherever direct contact outruns inherited explanation. It is already happening. It has always been happening. This transmission did not create it. It only turned toward it. Now the same invitation extends to whoever reaches this point. Do not merely agree. Do not merely admire. Do not merely conclude. Apply, see, and let the living system reveal itself through the only place it was ever truly knowable. The reality you are already inhabiting as experience.